Hi, guys, welcome back. HistSleep, the mirror of madness, in a cold stone chamber. Centuries before the hum of electricity or the hum of reason, a single candle flickered against the rough wall. The flame trembled in the draught, casting its unsteady light upon something that shimmered, something both beautiful and ridiculous. A bronze mirror. It wasn't quite a mirror, not as we would think of one. It was a flattened piece of metal, polished until it could almost reflect a face. Not a clear one, more like the ghost of a face, or the rumor of one. It was, in many ways, the perfect symbol of the age. Distorted, expensive, and dangerously full of imagination. In that dull reflection, a woman stared back at herself. Her name, if it ever mattered to anyone but her, is lost to history. But let's call her Isolde, because that sounds suitably medieval and tragic. Isolde was the daughter of a minor noble, rich enough to afford illusions, poor enough to need them. Every morning, she sat before her mirror of madness, as the monks outside the castle scribbled prayers and the peasants shoveled mud. Her maid, a silent girl with hands rough from lye soap, would hold the candle at just the right angle. The trick was to catch the faintest shimmer of light on her pale cheeks, to make her skin look like polished ivory rather than human flesh. Because in this world, beauty wasn't a gift, it was a duty. The medieval obsession with beauty wasn't born of vanity alone, it was a survival tactic, wrapped in superstition and social pressure. A woman's face could determine her fortune, her marriage, her dowry, her safety. A crooked nose might doom her to the convent. A freckle could invite rumors of witchcraft. And yet, no one really knew what beauty looked like. There were no photographs, no magazines, no filters, only poems written by men who had never seen a woman without candlelight. So they invented beauty the same way they invented dragons, with imagination, fear, and a little bit of wine. Isolde's reflection wavered. The mirror showed her not as she was, but as she feared she might be. The line between the two was thinner than the edge of her silver comb. Her mother had warned her, long ago, that a woman's worth lay not in her mind or her faith, but in her appearance. The Lord may see your soul, her mother had said, but men see your skin. So Isolde did what generations of women before and after her would do. She began to alter herself, to meet an impossible standard. She powdered her face with a mixture of white lead and vinegar, a deadly blend sold by traveling apothecaries who promised radiance beyond mortal nature. It worked. Her skin glowed pale and smooth, almost saintly. It also burned, but pain was part of the ritual. The sting of poison was a reminder that perfection came at a price, and that price was, quite literally, one's health. As the candlelight danced on her cheekbones, Isolde wondered if saints had ever felt beautiful. Their faces in the chapel frescoes were smooth and blank, framed by gold halos and impossible patience. She envied their serenity. She even envied their martyrdom. After all, saints died once. Women like her died a little every morning before their mirrors. Her maid coughed softly, breaking her trance. The sound echoed too loudly in the cold room. "To white?" Isolde asked, her tone carefully neutral. The maid hesitated. "Perhaps. A touch," she said. "You look divine," Isolde finished for her. The maid nodded quickly, because that was the only safe answer. Divine. The word carried the weight of both admiration and madness. Outside, the castle yard was a mess of smoke and mud. Peasants trudged through slush. Chickens scattered before them. Dogs barked without purpose. The air smelled of iron and sweat and earth. But inside the chamber, the world smelled of vinegar, herbs, and faint decay, the scent of alchemy, of beauty concocted in secrecy. On the wooden table beside her mirror lay the tools of her transformation. jars of strange powders, brushes made from boar hair, a vial of mercury rouge. Each item had a story. Each one had been bought with silver that could have fed a dozen peasants for a month. And yet, none of it was enough, because the mirror was never satisfied. Every flaw magnified. Every imagined imperfection became a prophecy. It wasn't just Isolde, of course. Across the kingdoms from Paris to Prague, women of rank and ruin alike stared into their polished bronze and cursed their reflections. Their faces became battlegrounds for survival in a world that offered them few other weapons. When night fell, Isolde's chamber glowed again with that same trembling candle. The mirror caught its light, throwing it back at her in uneven flashes. Her face looked fragmented, half saint, half shadow. She leaned closer, and for a moment, she saw something impossible, not her face, but the faint outline of someone else's. A trick of the light, perhaps, or maybe of her imagination. It looked younger, freer, untouched by powder or fear. The vision vanished as the candle sputtered. She blinked, startled. Was beauty meant to reveal the self, or to erase it? In her heart, she already knew the answer. Somewhere in the lower halls, the servants whispered that mirrors could steal a woman's soul. That if you stared too long, your spirit slipped through the bronze surface and became trapped in the reflection forever. Watching, forever fading, the church discouraged mirrors for exactly that reason. Vanity, they said, was the devil's favorite sin. But the same church that condemned beauty also painted the Virgin Mary with perfect symmetry and pale skin. Hypocrisy, too, was a medieval art form. Isolde ignored the warnings. She couldn't stop looking. The mirror had become her only honest companion. It didn't lie. It only distorted. It didn't flatter. It revealed the truth that beauty was a performance, and every performance needed an audience. She performed daily for her father's guests, for the gossiping maids, for the priests who spoke of purity with suspicious interest. Her mirror was her rehearsal space, her battlefield, her confession booth. On certain mornings, when the mist rolled off the moat and the cold seemed to crawl into her bones, Isolde wondered what it would feel like to live without mirrors, to wake up and be nothing. Would the world even notice if her beauty faded? Or was beauty the only proof she existed? These thoughts frightened her more than death itself. The maid entered quietly with a basin of cloudy water. "My lady," she said softly, "your skin bleeds again." Isolde touched her cheek. The lead mixture had cracked, revealing small sores beneath. "It's nothing," she whispered. "A price to pay." She smiled faintly, though her lips trembled. The maid lowered her gaze. Isolde's face, once luminous, now looked almost transparent. But in the flickering candlelight, she seemed ethereal, like one of those painted saints she envied. Perhaps that was the point. Perhaps, in her quiet suffering, she had finally become beautiful enough to be worshipped. The mirror, though, did not care for worship. It only reflected, and as the days passed, Isolde's reflection began to look less like herself and more like a stranger, someone pale, tired, and hollow-eyed, someone who might have once been alive. The villagers who glimpsed her from afar whispered that Lady Isolde was blessed. "She glows," they said. "She shines like moonlight." They didn't know it was poison at night. She dreamed of the river outside the castle walls. She dreamed of plunging her hands into cold, clean water and seeing her true reflection ripple on its surface unpainted, unpoisoned, unjudged. But when she woke, the mirror awaited. It always did. Her reflection would greet her patiently, mockingly, lovingly, and she would begin again the ritual of beauty, the liturgy of appearance. Because in her world, no sin was worse than being ordinary. The candlelight dimmed. Isolde leaned forward, her breath fogging the metal. For just a heartbeat. Her reflection didn't mimic her movement. It blinked a moment too late. A chill crept up her spine. She wanted to look away, but couldn't. The mirror had her now down in the servants' quarters. The maid whispered a prayer. She had heard that some women disappeared after staring too long into their mirrors. Not physically, but spiritually. Their laughter became hollow. Their eyes, distant. Their souls, quietly missing. She thought of her mistress, alone upstairs, chasing perfection in a room where even the candlelight seemed afraid to flicker too brightly. The next morning, Isolde didn't rise with the dawn. When the maid entered, the candle had long since burned out, and the mirror was clouded with dust. Isolde sat before it, her posture perfect, her face still and white as marble. For a moment, the maid thought she slept sitting upright, but when she touched her shoulder, the skin was cold, and yet on the mirror's surface a faint, smiling reflection still looked back. The servants said it was a miracle. The priest called it vanity's punishment. The apothecary called it a predictable reaction to mercury. But the mirror remained. It hung in that room for generations, long after Isolde's name was forgotten. Visitors swore they could see her face still, faintly shimmering in the bronze. Her beauty eternal at last. Centuries later, historians would write about medieval beauty with fascination and disgust. They would call it primitive, toxic, tragic. But what they wouldn't understand was this. For women like Isolde, beauty wasn't about vanity, it was about existence. To be beautiful was to be seen. To be seen was to be remembered. And to be remembered was the only kind of immortality available to them. The mirror of madness had done its work. It had given her what every medieval woman feared, losing identity, even if it cost her everything else. Pale was power. The sun was rising, but no one in Isolde's world ever wanted sunlight. Sunlight was for peasants, for those who worked the fields, who baked beneath its glare, who smelled of sweat and honest labor. In the upper chambers of the castle, where the air was perfumed and the curtains heavy, morning was not something to greet. It was something to defend against. To step into the sun was to risk exposure, to risk color. And color, in the medieval mind, meant corruption. Pale skin wasn't just a beauty ideal, it was a class badge. A visual declaration that you did not toil, that you were born above the soil, not within it. The whiter your skin, the purer your bloodline. Or so they said. No one really believed it, not deep down. But like all good lies, it was repeated often enough to feel true. In the narrow, drafty mirror room, Isolde's maid drew the curtains tight. The candlelight returned, gentle and forgiving. The young lady's skin looked almost translucent now, an effect bought with months of sacrifice and small doses of poison. The lead mixture had changed her complexion into something otherworldly. When she walked, people looked twice, not out of admiration, but out of unease. She had begun to look like an apparition of herself. At dinner, the other nobles whispered about her glow. "She looks divine," said one. "She looks unwell," said another, and in truth, both were right. Her father, proud and anxious, took the compliments as a sign that his daughter was ascending socially, if not spiritually. "Whiteness," he said over wine, "is the language of refinement. The French court prizes it. Even the queen keeps her skin as pale as parchment." He didn't mention the queen's frequent fainting fits, her trembling hands, or her sudden nosebleeds. Those were side effects of elegance. Isolde listened silently, fingers tracing the rim of her cup. The wine looked dark and rich, too alive against her ghostly hands. She wondered, not for the first time, if beauty could drain the life out of a person like blood from a wound. But she smiled anyway. Her mother's voice still echoed in her mind. Never let them see you flushed. Red cheeks belong to the working class. So she remained still, pale, perfect, and utterly exhausted. Beyond the castle walls, the village women had their own versions of beauty. They scrubbed their faces with rough salt, rubbed honey on sunburns, and laughed in the fields with cheeks glowing from wind and work. Their beauty was loud and alive. Isolde's was quiet, fragile, and purchased, and yet, if one of those women passed through the gates and dared show her face before the noble court, she would be scorned as ruddy or uncivilized. The higher you climbed, the less human you were allowed to look. At twilight, Isolde often walked in the garden, covered from head to toe in layers of fabric. A veil shielded her from the dying sun. The air was sweet with lavender and rot. She moved slowly, like a figure in a painting come to life. Children who saw her from afar whispered that the castle kept a ghost in its garden. They weren't entirely wrong. Her maid, Mira, sometimes dared to speak when no one else was listening. "My lady," she said one evening, "you could let the sun touch you, just a little. It might bring warmth to your skin." Isolde turned sharply, eyes wide with something between fear and pride. "Warmth," she said softly, "is for those who can afford to be ordinary." She didn't mean it cruelly, but Mira flinched anyway. The words hung in the air, heavy as dust. Paleness had become her armor. It protected her from judgment, even as it slowly consumed her. People bowed when she passed. Priests called her blessed. Artists wanted to paint her, and all the while, the poison seeped deeper, her bones ached. Her lips cracked, but in the mirror, her reflection gleamed like ivory. Perfection was never painless, it simply required one to stop calling the pain by its name. At court gatherings, she noticed a strange pattern. The paler a woman appeared, the less anyone listened to her. They stared, admired, compared but never heard. The noblemen spoke of wars and taxes and alliances. The women sat like silent statues, each pretending not to notice how the others were fading, slowly and beautifully, into illness. It was a pageant of ghosts pretending to be gods. One night, a visiting scholar from Italy, a doctor of sorts, asked Isolde a question no one else dared. "My lady," he said gently, "why must your beauty look like death?" She smiled faintly, a perfect practiced curve. "Because," she whispered, "death is the only thing that stays pure." The scholar said nothing more. He merely watched her as one might watch a candle burn too close to its end. The church had its own opinion. Of course, paleness symbolized chastity, the mark of divine modesty. To look warm or flushed was to appear sinful, touched by temptation or desire. Painters began to depict angels with skin so pale it almost glowed blue. Virginity, apparently, came in shades of frost. And so, every woman learned to bleach herself into holiness. Isolde's mirror became her altar. Each morning, she performed her devotions with the precision of a monk. The white powder, the vinegar wash, the gentle stroke of the boar hair brush, her reflection shimmered like a ghost baptized in poison. When she blinked, a tear rolled down her cheek and left a streak of gray where it touched her skin. Sometimes, she imagined peeling away the powder, layer by layer, until her true face returned. Would anyone recognize her? Would she recognize herself? But then, she would remember the look of disgust on her father's face when he spoke of ruddy peasants, and she would reach for the powder again. Freedom, she had learned, often came disguised as obedience. Mira, her maid, began keeping count of the empty jars. By winter, there were 12, each one labeled in Latin, promising beauty, purity, salvation, each one a lie. When Mira tried to throw them away, Isolde stopped her. "Leave them," she said. "They remind me of what perfection costs." The maid obeyed. But at night, she dreamed of the jars clinking softly, whispering to each other in the dark. The castle physician noticed the changes too. "Lady Isolde," he said during one of his visits, "your humors are imbalanced. You must eat more meat, more broth. Stay out of draughts." She nodded politely, knowing he would never say the real words. "Stop poisoning yourself, medicine." After all, bowed to money and beauty was the most expensive disease of all. By spring, her reflection had become something ethereal, almost divine. Visitors said she glowed even in darkness. But Mira, watching closely, saw something else: the faint blue lines of veins beneath the skin, the tremor in her hands, the way her breath came short after a few steps. The mirror had won another soul. One night, Isolde sat before her reflection and spoke aloud, her voice trembling. "If pale means pure," she whispered, "then I must be holy by now." The mirror said nothing, but the candlelight flickered, and for an instant her reflection smiled, though she herself had not. The next morning, she refused the lead powder. For the first time in months, she walked into the sunlight. The warmth shocked her like a forgotten memory returning uninvited. She stood there, trembling, as the color rushed back to her cheeks. It felt like rebellion. It felt like blood. It felt alive. Mira gasped softly behind her. "My lady, you look human?" Isolde finished. She smiled. For the first time, it didn't hurt. But as she turned back toward the castle, something strange caught her eye in the window above. Her bronze mirror gleamed, and though she stood in the courtyard, she could see her reflection perfectly, still pale, still ghostly, still trapped in the glass. It smiled faintly, a cold, unblinking smile. Isolde stepped closer to the sunlight, her heart pounding. Perhaps freedom, she thought, was not about escaping the mirror, but about accepting that it would always watch. The reflection was her past, her prison, her warning. She turned away at last, letting the warmth of the morning soak into her skin. The mirror in the tower dimmed, waiting for its next devotee, because in that age, the lesson remained unchanged. Pale was power, and power was never without a cost. The deadly glow. The room smelled of vinegar and death. Softly, almost gently, the fumes curled upward, weaving through the cold morning air like a ghost searching for meaning. Isolde sat before her mirror again. The bronze had dulled, its surface spotted with age and fingerprints. Her own reflection blinked back, patient, curious to patient. Perhaps she hadn't meant to return to it. After that morning in the sun, she had promised herself freedom. But freedom, like beauty, was a fragile thing in her world. It cracked under pressure. Now, she was back in her seat, the candle lit, the mirror waiting. On the table lay a new jar, its glass faintly clouded from travel. Inside shimmered a soft white paste, glowing faintly even in the dark. The label written in elegant Latin read, "Aqua Lunaris," the light of the moon. It had arrived 2 nights before, carried by a merchant who claimed it was the newest secret from Venice, used by the wives of dukes and the mistresses of kings. "Just a touch," he had said, "and your face will shine with divine light, as if kissed by the moon herself." The price? Too high for reason. But then, beauty always charged what truth could not. Isolde twisted the lid open. A faint hiss escaped like a sigh. The scent was sharp, metallic, and strangely sweet. Mercury and vinegar, the alchemy of death disguised as purity. She dipped her finger into the paste and touched it to her cheek. Cold, then warm, then burning. Her skin prickled, but when she glanced at the mirror, her reflection shimmered. Her face seemed luminous, smooth, unearthly, untouched by flaw or fatigue. It worked. It always worked. That was the curse. Beautiful, whispered Mira, though her voice carried fear more than awe. Isolde smiled faintly, her lips trembling. The light suits me, doesn't it? My lady, Mira said carefully. It hurts your skin. Pain, Isolde said softly, is the price of perfection. The saints bled for their faith. I bleed for mine. Mira wanted to protest, but she didn't. No one ever did. The mirror, after all, punished disbelief by evening. Her cheeks were radiant, feverish in their glow. The guests at dinner gasped politely. The men bowed. The women stared, each calculating the formula behind her skin. What potion is that? One whispered. Isolde only smiled. Moonlight, she said. They laughed nervously, not sure whether to envy or fear her. The next morning, she woke with the taste of metal on her tongue. Her fingertips trembled. Her breath felt heavier. But her face looked flawless. The mirror had rewarded her devotion. She applied another layer, then another. Each coat dulled her senses and brightened her reflection. Her glow became her armor. Soon, word spread, Lady Isolde the Luminous One. The woman who glowed like holy marble. Songs whispered her name through taverns and courts alike. Merchants claimed they had sold her the potion. Painters begged to capture her image. She was no longer merely beautiful. She was legendary. But legends, in those days, had a short lifespan. The glow that made her radiant also made her sick. Her joints stiffened. Her vision blurred at night. Her lips cracked no matter how much balm she used. Sometimes, when she smiled, she tasted blood. The mirror showed none of it. It only showed perfection. At supper one night, a nobleman reached to compliment her complexion. His fingers brushed her hand and recoiled. Her skin was cold as stone. He smiled awkwardly, pretending not to notice, and poured more wine. Isolde pretended not to see the pity, or was it fear? In his eyes, in the flickering candlelight, she looked like a woman sculpted from alabaster. Later that night, she sat before the mirror again. Her reflection was magnificent, her reality less so. She reached for the jar of aqua lunaris again. Her hand shook. The paste sloshed, spilling onto the table, eating through the varnish with a soft hiss. Mira gasped and backed away. My lady, it's poison. All beauty is, Isolde murmured. There was a moment of silence, broken only by the faint crackling of the candle. My lady, Mira whispered. You don't need it. You're already what? Isolde interrupted. Perfect. Worthy, safe? Her voice trembled with something that wasn't anger, something more fragile. I'm not chasing beauty, she said quietly. I'm chasing safety. If I shine bright enough, they won't see how scared I am. It was the truest thing she had ever said. The maid said nothing. She could not explain to her mistress that the same glow which protected her also isolated her. People did not touch her anymore. They admired her, yes, but from a distance, as one admires fire or lightning. Too bright, too dangerous, too untouchable. Weeks passed. Her body grew weaker. Her glow grew stronger. When she walked through the hallways, servants would pause mid-task, uncertain whether to bow or cross themselves. She looked both blessed and cursed, divine and doomed, and perhaps she was all of those things at once. The castle physician returned, wringing his hands. My lady, he said, this glow is not of heaven, it is of mercury. You must stop before it kills you. She smiled, her lips pale as snow. And if I stop, then your skin will darken again, he said, hesitating. You'll heal, but you'll lose the light. Then I'll lose everything, she replied simply. He left her chamber without another word. He would not win an argument against vanity, especially when vanity had found religion at night. She dreamed of light, of endless white corridors and faces glowing like stars in her dream. She wasn't dying. She was adored. She would wake in tears, not knowing whether from joy or terror. Mira began praying nightly, not for Isolde's life, but for her release. Sometimes she would enter the room to find her mistress whispering to her reflection. The mirror's surface shimmered faintly, as if answering, "What does it tell you, my lady?" Mira asked once. Isolde smiled dreamily. "That I am eternal." Her voice cracked on the last word. The poison was winning now. Her hair began to thin. Her teeth ached. Her hands trembled even at rest. Still, the glow remained steady, unwavering, cruel. Visitors no longer recognized her. They whispered that the castle's lady had been replaced by a spirit, a relic of beauty too perfect for the living. And in a sense, they were right. One stormy night, thunder rolled across the valley. Isolde stood before her mirror. Candlelight quivering around her, the reflection smiled faintly, even when she did not. "You're beautiful," it whispered, or maybe she imagined it. She reached out a trembling hand, fingertips brushing the cold bronze. The mirror felt alive. Mira burst in at dawn to find the mirror cracked. The room smelled of metal and wine. On the floor, the jar of aqua lunaris lay shattered, its contents spreading in pale veins across the stone. Isolde sat before it, breathing shallowly, her face still glowing faintly in the dim light. "Don't touch me," she whispered when Mira rushed forward. "You'll ruin the light." Tears streaked Mira's face. "It's not light, my lady, it's poison." "Perhaps," Isolde said softly, "but poison shines longer than truth." Outside, the sun rose, weak and red over the horizon. Its warmth reached the windows, spilling across the floor, across her face. For the first time, her glow began to fade. Slowly, mercifully, the poison gave way to the light of something real. She closed her eyes in that moment. She felt the warmth she'd spent her life avoiding. And for the first time, it didn't burn. The mirror remained cracked, dark, but still faintly reflective. Those who looked into it swore they saw not their own faces, but a pale figure smiling faintly, eternally luminous. The villagers called it the deadly glow. They said if you stared long enough, your reflection would begin to shimmer too, and that somewhere, far beyond glass and reason, Lady Isolde would be waiting, forever beautiful, forever bright, forever gone. Bloodletting for beauty. The corridors of the castle smelled of iron again, not from battle, nor from rusting armor, but from the scent of freshly spilled blood, sweet and faint in the morning air. They said it was medicine. They said it was cleansing. They said it was beautiful in the year when the moon eclipsed the sun, a sign of vanity's renewal. The priests said the women of the northern courts began a new ritual, the bleeding cure, a drop a week, or 2, or 3, to purge the body of bad humors, and thus bad appearances. The logic was flawless by medieval standards. If blood carried sickness, then beauty could only bloom once the sickness was drained. And so, they bled for beauty. The first time Lady Isolde heard of it, she laughed. "Oh," she said softly, "so now they cut their wrists for compaction. How modern of them." Her laughter, though elegant, was hollow. Her glow had faded months ago, leaving her pale but no longer divine. Her body was recovering, slowly, painfully, from Mercury's kiss. Her vanity, however, remained untouched. A letter arrived from her cousin in Bruges, sealed with wax and perfume. "Dearest Isolde, you must try it. The Countess of Flanders swears by it. a cup of blood lost every fortnight, and her cheeks bloom like roses. She says it keeps the melancholy away. Yours, always bleeding for beauty, Cecily. Isolde read the letter twice. By the third time, she wasn't laughing anymore. Her maid Mira, seeing the return of that dangerous spark in her eyes, grew nervous. "My lady," she said, "you've only just healed. You can walk again without trembling. Please, do not begin another ritual." But Isolde's tone was soft, dreamlike, the same tone she used when her mirror still whispered. "Mira," she said, "you don't understand. The glow is gone. The men have stopped staring. Even the maids gossip again. My beauty was my armor. Without it, I'm just another woman waiting to age." "Then age," Mira said fiercely. "Better to grow old than to bleed yourself dry." Isolde smiled sadly. "Old age is a luxury for women who were never beautiful." The next day, she summoned the castle physician. He was an old man, half blind, his beard like frost. When she told him her request, he dropped the basin he carried. "My lady," he stammered, "bloodletting is a treatment, not a decoration. It's meant for fever, for swelling, not for beauty." "Then call it fever," she said coolly. "My vanity burns hotter than any illness." He hesitated, but she was a noble, and nobles paid in gold. Gold was thicker than reason. That evening, the physician arrived with his tools: a small silver lancet, a bowl of polished brass, a strip of cloth for the arm. The air smelled of wax and lavender. "Just a little," he said, voice trembling. "Too much, and I'll tell you when to stop." She interrupted. He nodded, unable to meet her eyes. The blade touched her skin, a brief sting, a whisper of warmth. A single drop appeared, red and round as a ruby that it rolled down her arm. Glinting in the candlelight, Isolde exhaled slowly, eyes fixed on it. "There," she whispered. "Already I feel lighter." The physician swallowed hard. He knew better than to argue with delusion, especially when delusion paid well. That night, she slept deeply, and when she woke the next morning, her cheeks indeed held color again, faint, fragile, but real. The mirror, now cracked but still loyal, seemed to approve. Her reflection smiled back with a touch of warmth she hadn't seen in months. "See, Mira," she said at breakfast, "the blood carries out the sorrow. What's left behind is beauty." Mira said nothing, but her hands shook as she poured the tea. The practice spread quickly through the castle. Maids whispered of it. Noble women visited discreetly, asking for the bleeding treatment. Within weeks, the physician's hands were red from work. The halls echoed with the soft sighs of women losing blood and gaining illusions. "Better pale than puffy," they said. "Better weak than wrinkled." Even the priest, when asked, declared that the practice could not offend God, so long as the blood was shed in moderation. Moderation, however, was not a virtue easily kept by those chasing perfection. By midsummer, Isolde was thinner, lighter, almost ghostly again, but her skin glowed, this time not from poison, but from emptiness. The hollowness suited her. She looked ethereal, as if she might vanish in sunlight. Visitors once more spoke her name with reverence. "The Lady of Pure Blood," they called her. "She bleeds herself to beauty." One afternoon, a young girl from the village came to the gates. She was no older than 16, her dress plain, her eyes hopeful. "My lady," she said shyly, "they say your blood makes your face like a saint's. Will it work for me too?" Isolde studied her. The girl's cheeks were already red, her youth radiant. She didn't need it. But then again, need had never stopped anyone. "Of course," Isolde said softly. Beauty is not born. It's made, Mira protested when she found out. You cannot teach her this. Why not? Isolde replied. Should beauty be a secret reserved for the rich? Let her feel what it means to be admired. But she's a child. So was I, Isolde whispered. When they first told me I was pretty, and that it mattered, the argument ended in silence. Neither woman could unlearn the lies they'd inherited by autumn. The village girls were bleeding too, not with the precision of physicians, but with kitchen knives and sewing needles. The rumor spread faster than reason. A little pain brings the glow. Mothers scolded their daughters, but some secretly joined them. Soon the local apothecary ran out of clean rags and bandages. Even faith could not compete with fashion. Isolde began fainting often. She would rise from her chair and the world would tilt. A slow, graceful descent into darkness. Each time, Mira caught her before she fell. My lady, please, she begged. You're killing yourself. But Isolde only smiled faintly. If I must die, she said, I'd rather die admired. Mira's tears fell onto her mistress's gown, staining it darker than blood. One night, while the moon hung low and red, Isolde awoke from a fever dream. She thought she saw her reflection standing beside the bed, whispering, You're almost perfect. It said, One more drop. When she blinked, it was gone. Only the basin of blood remained half full, gleaming faintly like a dark mirror. She dipped her fingers into it and drew a line across her cheek. A crimson blush to her face. For a moment, looked alive again by winter. The physician refused to return. She's draining herself to death, he told Mira. If she continues, her heart will stop. Tell her no more. Mira tried. She knelt, pleaded, even prayed aloud. But Isolde was beyond saving. Her faith was in beauty, and beauty had always demanded sacrifice. Each cut was a prayer, each drop an offering. She called it devotion. The castle grew quieter. The laughter of guests faded. The halls smelled faintly, always, of iron and rose water. Even the snow outside seemed reluctant to fall near her windows. Her reflection grew pale, her eyes darker, her lips nearly white. Yet she never looked more satisfied. The mirror, now fractured into 1,000 tiny shards, caught her image from every angle. No matter where she turned, she could see herself, endlessly multiplied, endlessly beautiful, endlessly broken. On the 12th night of Christmas, Mira entered the chamber with candles. Her mistress sat upright, eyes closed, a faint smile on her lips. The bowl at her feet was empty. Her hands rested calmly on her lap, a single cut fresh across her arm in her other hand. She held a mirror fragment. Her reflection stared back from it, frozen in eternal satisfaction. Mira wept. She did not call for the priest. She did not scream. She only whispered the prayer of the forgotten. May she find warmth where vanity could not. Then she blew out the candles. The room sank into shadow, save for one faint glimmer from the mirror shard, a ghostly light pulsing like a heartbeat. Outside, the snow began to fall again. Weeks later, travelers passing through the castle swore they could hear dripping in the hallways, a steady rhythm, like water from a leaky roof. But when they followed the sound, they found no leak, only the echo of something that once was alive. They called it the weeping of the walls, and among the villagers, a new superstition was born. If a woman stared too long at her reflection during the full moon, she might hear a whisper, soft, seductive, and cold. One more drop. For beauty. Hair today, gone tomorrow. The first thing anyone noticed about Lady Isolde, before the glow, before the bleeding, before the madness, was her hair. It was long, impossibly long, the color of spun honey caught in morning light. Servants whispered that it never tangled, even when she slept. Poets wrote of it. Golden ropes, silken rivers, divine snares for mortal hearts. Men envied its softness. Women envied its power. And in a world where beauty was a currency, Isolde's hair was gold. When she walked through the corridors, her hair trailed behind her like a royal train. She had to carry it draped over one arm, as though it were alive. Even the queen once joked, if God had hair like that, he would never wear a crown. It was meant as a compliment. Isolde took it as a prophecy. But hair, in medieval Europe, was never just hair. It was a sermon, a symbol, a sentence. In the monasteries, women shaved their heads to prove holiness. In the brothels, they grew their hair long to prove sin. And between those two extremes, the holy and the damned, stood every other woman, trying to thread her soul through a comb's teeth. After her illness, after the mirror cracked and the bleeding ended, Isolde's reflection still had one faithful ally. Her hair. It remained thick, golden, perfect. Even when her face turned pale and her voice grew faint, her hair glowed like memory. It was the one thing she could still control. Control, after all, was what beauty always promised. But control is a fragile comfort, especially when the whispers of fashion begin to change. The year was 1473, when a new trend drifted up from Florence like a fever. The high forehead. It was the mark of intelligence, grace, and refinement. The higher the brow, the nobler the soul. Women plucked their hairlines into extinction, sometimes using hot ash, sometimes using lime paste. By winter, half the court had burned away their beauty in the name of progress. When Isolde first heard of it, she laughed softly. High foreheads. What will they think of necks cutting off their noses to improve their profiles? Mira, her maid, smiled timidly. Perhaps, my lady, this is one fashion you might skip. But vanity, like fever, relapses easily. A week later, a letter arrived from Bruges, another from her cousin Cecily, ever the messenger of madness. Dearest Isolde, you must see it. The Duchess of Milan looks divine, her brow as smooth as ivory, her face like a page yet to be written upon. They say the hairline of Venus was nearly at her crown. You must try it, or risk looking dated. Yours, eternally plucked, Cecily. Isolde read it twice. By the third reading, she was standing before the mirror. Mira stood behind her, comb in hand. My lady, please, your hair is your last treasure. That's precisely why it must go, Isolde said calmly. Beauty cannot stand still. It must evolve, or die. But you've already bled enough for beauty. Isolde smiled faintly, then let the hair bleed instead. The first pluck came with a small, sharp sting. It wasn't pain. Exactly. It was revelation. A hair pulled free. A single surrender. She could feel the emptiness it left. The skin cool beneath her fingertips. It was strangely exhilarating. She continued, pluck, pluck, pluck. The rhythm became addictive. The sound of control returning, one hair at a time. After an hour, her temples burned. Her forehead was red and raw, but higher, visibly so. She stared at her reflection, half horrified, half enchanted. Her eyes seemed larger now, her features sharper. She looked intelligent, holy, almost superior. Do you see, Mira? She whispered. It changes everything. Mira didn't answer. She was staring at the pile of golden strands on the floor, a halo undone by morning. The redness had deepened into blisters. The mirror, as always, lied. showing only the illusion she wanted to the world. She appeared enlightened. Inside, her skin throbbed. She pressed cool rose water to her brow, hiding the pain behind perfume. Soon, her look became a sensation. Noble women came to her chambers seeking advice. "How do you achieve such refinement?" they asked. She smiled serenely. "Sacrifice, my dear, always sacrifice." They left her room lighter and a little less hairy by midsummer. The castle looked like a convent of vanity women, with half brows and raw foreheads drifted through the halls like pale statues. Mira tried not to stare. The men pretended to admire it. They whispered among themselves, calling it the era of the thinking forehead, as though intellect could be plucked from one's skull. But Isolde believed it. She always believed the lie, if it sounded noble enough. Her hairline crept higher and higher each week. A little more vanished, and as the hair receded, her pride advanced. "I see more clearly now," she told Mira one night. "It's as though the face itself expands to meet the light." Mira nodded quietly, too tired to argue. When Isolde slept, Mira swept up the fallen hairs, bundles of gold like autumn leaves. She could not bear to throw them away. She kept them in a box, labeled before. By autumn, the fashion reached absurdity. Some women began shaving their entire brows to achieve the pure dome, a forehead vast enough to contain wisdom. Isolde hesitated only briefly before joining them. The razor glided across her brow, a whisper of surrender. When it was done, her face looked alien. "Do I look wiser?" she asked softly. Mira's voice cracked. "You look enlightened." It was not a compliment. Her head now resembled the portraits of angels painted on chapel ceilings, serene, strange, nearly bald. But something inside her began to tremble. Without her hair, she no longer recognized herself. Her reflection stared back like a stranger, proud, empty, and infinitely fragile. She began wearing veils, claiming it was for modesty. But everyone knew it was to hide what beauty had cost her this time. One night, the wind howled through the corridors. Isolde sat by the fire, veil removed, staring at the flames. "You know," she said softly, "they say hair carries memory, that when you cut it, you lose a piece of who you were." Mira glanced up from her sewing. "Then, my lady, you've forgotten too much already." Isolde smiled faintly. "Perhaps that's mercy." The fire crackled in agreement. By winter, her hair refused to grow back. The constant plucking, the lime, the burns, they had scarred her scalp. Her skin gleamed pale under candlelight, smooth and cold like marble. She had become her own statue. The mirror, cruel as ever, still showed her as perfect. But perfection, by now, looked eerily close to death. Visitors whispered again. "She's changed," they said. "There's something ghostly about her now." "She looks eternal," said another. "She looks empty," said a third. Both were right. One morning, Mira brought her a comb, an old habit, a relic of gentler days. Isolde stared at it for a long time. Then she laughed, quietly at first, then louder, until the sound filled the room. "What a foolish thing," she said between breaths. "A comb for a ghost." She placed it on the table beside her broken mirror. Neither had use any more. That night, she dreamt of her hair, alive again, swirling around her like golden smoke. It whispered, "We remember you." She reached out, trying to grasp it, but her fingers passed through light. When she woke, the pillow beneath her was empty, only dust and silence. By spring, rumors spread that Lady Isolde had gone mad. Some said she spent hours tracing her scalp with her fingers. searching for forgotten strands. Others swore they saw her brushing invisible hair, smiling faintly as though combing memory itself. The servants avoided her room. Only Mira remained, faithful, fearful, forever watching beauty decay into myth. And in the town below, mothers warned their daughters, beware the mirror and the comb, for vanity steals softly, first your glow, then your blood, then your hair, until you are nothing but skin, memory, and silence. They called the tail hair today, gone tomorrow. No one knew whether Lady Isolde still lived, or whether she had been woven into her own legend, a ghost with no hair, but too much history. Brows be gone. There comes a point in every fashion when madness starts to masquerade as refinement. And in the year when Lady Isolde's forehead had finally conquered most of her face, there remained one last frontier of imperfection: the brows. They were small, insignificant, barely visible, and yet unbearable. They sat there, like two stubborn reminders of humanity. Such shadows ruin the purity of the face, said the pamphlets from Florence. Only the ignorant still wear brows. And that, of course, was all the invitation vanity needed. Isolde stood before her mirror again, the fractured bronze surface catching 100 versions of her face, each one watching the other with silent expectation. Her scalp had healed into smooth, pale skin. Her hairline was high and regal, but her eyebrows, yes, those remained arc, defiant, terribly alive. Mira hovered nearby with the patience of the damned. My lady, she said softly, they protect the eyes. God gave them for a reason. Isolde smiled faintly. Then let God take them back. The tools of transformation were simple: a small blade, some quicklime paste, and a mirror to forgiving for honesty. Isolde began at the center, each scrape accompanied by a sound like the sigh of parchment. Tiny black hairs fell onto the table, like punctuation marks in a letter she no longer wished to read. The pain was immediate, sharp, then warm, then strangely cleansing. It was always the same. Every ritual hurt, and every hurt felt holy. When she was done, she looked at herself for a long time. The absence was shocking. Without her brows, her face seemed naked, her expressions unreadable. She tilted her head slightly. Her reflection stared back, emotionless, perfect, unblinking, magnificent. She whispered, like marble, like sainthood, like death. That evening, when the candlelight flickered across her face, Mira gasped softly. My lady, she said, you look different. Different, Isolde repeated. That's what beauty means, doesn't it? To be set apart. Mira hesitated. It also means to be seen. Isolde smiled, a small, slow curl of the lips. Then let them look. Let them wonder what's missing. And they did at supper. The noblemen murmured among themselves. Her face, pale, smooth, unbrowed, looked ethereal, yet strangely inhuman. One courtier whispered, she looks like a statue come to life. Another muttered, no, like a spirit pretending to be flesh. Neither were wrong. Isolde sat silently, drinking her wine, letting the whispers feed her vanity. They were talking again, and that was all she'd ever wanted. By morning, the women followed. Within a week, half the castle was browless. They used pumice, ashes, blades, even thread soaked in vinegar. They called it refinement. They called it progress. But in the mirror, progress always bled a little. The men didn't understand to them. The women all looked perpetually surprised, or quietly furious. Yet none dared say it aloud. Not when those women stared at them with smooth, Endless foreheads and eyes that never blinked. It was unnerving, as if the soul had been erased from their faces, leaving only devotion behind. One night, Isolde hosted a gathering. Candles lined the hall like tiny witnesses. The air smelled of lavender and scorched lime. All around her sat women, glowing, pale, browless, identical in their pursuit of perfection. They raised their glasses in silent triumph. "We have shed what hides the truth," said one. "The eyes," another added, "are the windows of the soul." And now, the curtains are gone. The room erupted in soft laughter. Mira, serving wine in the corner, nearly dropped the tray. She had never seen so many saints in one room, or so many sinners pretending to be them by spring. Isolde's skin began to change again. The lime paste had burned deep. Her brow bones were tender and red. The faintest breeze made her wince. Still, she applied white lead to cover the wounds. It stung. She smiled through it. Every sting was a step closer to salvation. Mira began to keep the shutters closed. Too much sunlight, she said, would hurt her lady's skin. But she also knew that if Isolde ever saw herself clearly, in daylight, without candlelight's mercy, she might finally see the monster the mirror refused to show. So Mira closed the light away, and in the dark, Isolde's beauty became a rumor even she couldn't quite remember. Sometimes, when she was alone, Isolde would draw new brows with soot and oil, soft arches, delicate and fleeting. Then she'd wash them off again, ashamed. What is perfection? She wondered aloud, if it can be painted. The mirror gave no answer. Only her reflection stared back, expressionless, eternal, and more ghost than woman. One afternoon, a visiting artist came to the castle. He was Italian, loud and fascinated by the northern customs. When he saw Isolde, he bowed deeply, murmuring, "My lady, your face, it is divine. May I paint it?" She hesitated, then nodded. He worked for hours, muttering to himself about geometry and balance. When he finished, he turned the canvas around. Isolde gasped. The woman in the painting was beautiful. Yes, but not her dad. It was a creature made of angles and light, cold and symmetrical. "Do I look like that?" she whispered. The artist smiled. "No one looks like that, but everyone wants to." That night, she could not sleep. The painting haunted her, not because it was false, but because it might have been truer than she dared admit. She rose quietly and stood before her mirror. The reflection looked back, pale, browless, perfect, the face of a woman who had traded expression for eternity. She whispered to it, "Do you still know me?" The silence answered, "No." By summer, the browless fever spread beyond the castle walls. Even village girls began scraping their brows with candle wax, believing it made them look noble. The priests called it vanity. The merchants called it opportunity. They sold ointments, powders, and miracle lime to desperate faces. And somewhere, in every small mirror across the region, a reflection watched its owner disappear one stroke at a time. Mira grew thin with worry. She stopped praying for Isolde's recovery and began praying for her memory. That something, anything, human might remain inside that pale marble shell. Sometimes, she thought she saw flickers of it. A tear when no one watched. A hesitation before the mirror. A breath too heavy to be holy. But the next morning, it was always gone, wiped away like a misplaced eyebrow. One evening, a storm swept across the valley. Thunder rolled like judgment. Lightning illuminated the window. Isolde sat alone in her room, candles extinguished, staring into the cracked mirror. Raindrops tapped against the glass, distorting her reflection into ripples of white and shadow. For the first time in months, She saw not beauty, but loss. Her face looked empty, incomplete. Her eyes seemed desperate, searching for something that wasn't there anymore. Her brows, those small, stubborn lines of humanity, had once given her expression, emotion, soul. Without them, she looked like silence itself. She reached out and touched the mirror. I wanted to be admired, she whispered, not erased. The reflection didn't move. It never did. And in that stillness, she realized the cruelest truth. She hadn't been creating perfection. She'd been creating absence. When the storm passed, Mira entered to find her mistress asleep by the window, her head bowed, her hand still on the mirror's edge. The next morning, Isolde awoke strangely calm. Tooth or dare, there are few things more dangerous in history than a smile. It starts as a curve of kindness, a flicker of warmth, and then, in the hands of vanity, it becomes a weapon in the medieval courts. A smile was no mere gesture. It was a declaration of breeding, restraint, and mystery. To wide, and you were vulgar. To bright, and you were common. To sincere, and you were doomed. Lady Isolde had forgotten how to smile properly. Not that she lacked reasons. There were banquets, admirers, whispers of her beauty that reached even the abbés. But in her world, joy was dangerous, especially when it showed teeth. Her mother used to say, "A noble woman's teeth are like her secrets. The fewer seen, the longer she lives." And so, Isolde learned to hide them, one tight-lipped expression at a time. Teeth were an odd thing in that era. The peasants had theirs, yellowed, crooked, honest, but the nobility, they had standards. White teeth were suspicious, too clean, too bright, signs of vanity or witchcraft. That was almost respectable, a sign that one could afford sugar and rich wine. So, when Isolde's teeth began to ache, the dull throb of too much honeyed bread and spiced cider, she considered it not illness, but prestige. Of course, pain was not fashionable, not yet, so she sent for Brother Aldrich, the castle's resident tooth physician, a man who smelled faintly of vinegar and philosophy. He arrived with a satchel of tools, none of which looked remotely medical. "My lady," he said, bowing low, "your beauty depends upon balance. A perfect face must not suffer from imperfect breath." He spoke as if reciting scripture. Isolde, too weak to argue, nodded. The cure, as always, was worse than the illness. He mixed ashes of burnt rosemary, crushed pearls, and a few drops of sheep's urine, the latest fashion in dental cleansing. "Swish this," he said cheerfully. Isolde obeyed, gagging delicately as the bitterness hit her tongue. The pain lessened. The smell did not. Still, Aldrich smiled with pride. "Radiance, my lady," he said. "A queen's mouth should taste like sacrifice." That night, Mira lit a candle and watched her mistress spit black flecks into a silver bowl. "My lady," she whispered, "you're bleeding." Isolde wiped her lips, unconcerned. A small price for grace. Her gums stung. Her mouth burned. She smiled into the mirror, carefully, deliberately. It was a strange smile, both pained and perfect, a victory carved from suffering. In the following weeks, Isolde's smile became the talk of the court. It wasn't warm. It was enigmatic, a secret folded behind pale lips. Men mistook it for mystery. Women mistook it for power. It was neither. It was restraint. Isolde smiled the way soldiers wear armor, not for joy, but defense. The queen noticed at a spring banquet, amid the smell of meat and honey wine. She leaned close and whispered, "My dear Isolde, how do you keep your lips so still? You look as if carved from stone." Isolde lowered her gaze. Because, your grace, stone never offends. The queen laughed, though not fully. There was something unsettling about beauty that didn't move. Of course, not all women shared Isolde's discipline. One baron's wife, a cheerful woman named Helena, dared to laugh openly during supper. Her teeth flashed white in the candlelight. A ripple of whispers followed. Too many teeth, one lady murmured. Too much joy, said another, and before the week was out, rumors of witchcraft spread like spilled ink. Helena was gone by midsummer. From that day on, Isolde smiled less. She ate less, too. Food stained the teeth. After all, Mira noticed the change. The hollow cheeks, the faint trembling when Isolde spoke. "My lady," she said one morning, "you're starving yourself." "I'm refining," Isolde replied. "Beauty thrives on hunger." Mira wanted to protest but didn't. In this castle, reason had long been declared unfashionable. There were other remedies, too, imported from France and whispered about by the wealthiest courtiers. Powders made from coral and crushed bone, toothpicks carved from silver and dipped in mint oil, and the newest invention of all, a paste of vinegar and pumice said to make one's breath angelic. It worked, briefly. Then it stripped the enamel clean away. Soon, Isolde began to avoid mirrors. Her reflection no longer seemed to belong to her. The lips were thinner, the skin paler. Her teeth, once a quiet source of pride, had become uneven. Their edges darkened like forgotten pearls. She pressed her fingers to her mouth in the silence. She could feel her heartbeat pulsing through her gums. It was like listening to the echo of a secret you couldn't take back. And yet, her admirers only grew. They called her the silent smile, the pale grace, the lady who speaks without teeth. Poets wrote sonnets about her composure. Painters begged to capture her lips in shadow. No one noticed the rot beneath the paint, the sickness blooming under beauty's surface. Or maybe they did, and preferred it that way. In private, Isolde's teeth began to loosen. One morning, while rinsing with rose water, a molar slipped free and fell into the basin with a quiet clink. She stared at it, horrified, yet fascinated. It was so small, so human, a piece of herself, detached, perfect in its impermanence. She wrapped it in silk and hid it in a jewelry box, a keepsake of her devotion. The days that followed were filled with whispers. Her speech grew softer, her smiles rarer. When she did speak, her words came through half-closed lips, a voice meant not for conversation but confession. People leaned closer to hear her. They mistook her weakness for wisdom. It was, perhaps, her finest illusion yet. Mira pleaded with her. "My lady, you must eat. You must rest." Isolde only smiled, faintly. Rest is for those who have nothing left to perfect. Mira wanted to shake her, to scream, but she could and single quotes t. The madness had become too beautiful to touch. By autumn, Isolde's smiles had vanished completely. At gatherings, she covered her mouth with lace fans or jeweled hands. When she laughed, rarely, it was silent, her shoulders trembling but her lips unmoved. She had become a portrait of grace, a living statue. But in her chamber, when the candles were gone and the mirror waited in the dark, she sometimes reached for her reflection and whispered, "Do I still look alive?" The silence never answered. Her reflection, of course, had no teeth either. It only watched her, that pale, toothless ghost, with pity she couldn't bear. Sometimes, she imagined the mirror's version of herself laughing freely, brightly, terribly alive. She would almost hear the sound. Then she'd remember Helena, the baron's wife, and the sound would fade. One morning, The artist returned, the same man who had painted her months before. He studied her carefully and frowned. "You've changed," he said. "Your beauty. It's quieter now, more frightening." "Good," she said softly. "Fear lasts longer than admiration." He said nothing more. When he left, he took the portrait with him, though no one ever saw it displayed again. Winter arrived. The castle grew colder, quieter, stiller. Isolde rarely spoke. Her meals were soft. Soups, wine, honey, gentle things that required no chewing. Her lips, though pale, remained perfectly shaped. And sometimes, when the candlelight hit her face just right, she looked like an angel carved by sorrow. But the closer one looked, the more one saw, not divinity, but decay. On the night of the first frost, Mira found her mistress asleep before the mirror. As always, a candle flickered low beside her. Her hand rested gently against her jaw. Her lips parted slightly, revealing only darkness where teeth once were. Mira knelt and wept quietly, for the beauty that had been worshipped, and the humanity that had been lost to it. The mirror said nothing that it never did, but if one looked closely, in the curve of the candle's reflection, in the faint shimmer across the glass, one might almost swear that Isolde's reflection smiled again. A real smile, at last, not perfect, not poised, just free. Perfume of pain. There are certain smells that never truly leave you. The smell of rain on stone, the faint sweetness of candle wax, and beneath it all, the quiet rot of time in the medieval world. Scent was not a luxury. It was a defense against sickness, against sin, against being human. Lady Isolde understood this all too well. Her face, now pale as milk, had lost expression. Her teeth, fragile memories of vanity, had mostly vanished. But scent, scent still obeyed her. When beauty failed the mirror, it could still haunt the air each morning. Mira would open the shutters and gag softly. The room reeked of something. Roses drowned in vinegar, lavender steeped in wine, musk, smoke, and faint decay. It was intoxicating, both divine and unbearable. "My lady," she coughed, fanning the air, "you've enough perfume to bless a cathedral." Isolde only smiled. "Then perhaps I shall be remembered there." Her perfumes had become her identity. Each bottle was a chapter of her soul, crafted in glass and gold, lined along her vanity like soldiers of fragrance. There was essence of lily for sorrow, amber tears for memory, and saint's breath, her favorite, distilled from crushed violets and camphor, rumored to preserve flesh after death. "Wear it nightly," said the merchant who sold it. "You'll smell immortal." He did not mention that immortality and poison often shared the same bottle. By midday, Isolde would layer scent upon scent until the air itself seemed to shimmer. Servants would whisper, "You can smell her before you see her." It was meant as a compliment, but sometimes, when she entered the hall, men flinched, not from disgust, but from confusion. The sweetness was suffocating, a beauty so thick it became fear. At the evening feasts, candles burned low as her perfume mingled with roasted meats and smoke. It made people lightheaded, dizzy, as if her presence carried its own weather. Even the queen remarked once, fanning herself, "Isolde, dear, you bring springtime wherever you go." To which Isolde replied, "Springtime smells sweetest before it dies." The queen laughed, uncertain whether it was a jest or a confession. The truth, of course, was darker. Isolde's perfumes weren't just masks of luxury. They were armor against decay, against her own body, which had begun to betray her. Her gums bled, her skin thinned, and sometimes her hair came away in her brush. She knew it. Mira knew it. No one spoke of it. Instead, they spoke of her fragrance. Each scent had its ritual. A few drops behind the ear for memory, a dab at the throat for devotion, a mist across the chest to quiet the heart, and finally, a trace at the wrist to remind herself she was still alive. The bottles emptied faster now, and with every one she finished, the silence grew heavier, as if the perfumes were keeping more than just her beauty alive. One evening, as snow whispered against the windows, Mira entered quietly. She found her mistress surrounded by bottles, open, half spilled, glimmering in candlelight. "My lady," she said softly, "this air is poison." Isolde looked up, eyes distant. "Then let me breathe it. I've inhaled worse." Mira hesitated. "Why do this to yourself?" "Because scent," Isolde murmured, "is the only thing that never forgets." That night, Mira dreamed of gardens, not real ones, but the kind from before the plague, before fear scented the world. In her dream, Isolde walked among flowers that smelled too sweet to live. When she woke, the room still smelled of them, and for a moment, Mira thought she might never escape the perfume, that it had entered her lungs, her blood, her prayers. By spring, word of Isolde's fragrance had spread beyond the castle. Pilgrims came, believing her scent miraculous. Merchants sold vials of her essence, diluted oils labeled eau d'Isolde. Some claimed it healed sadness. Others said it summoned ghosts. No one agreed on the truth. They only agreed that once you smelled it, you never forgot it. But the truth was simple and terrible. Her perfumes contained ingredients no longer found in nature. Tinctures of mercury, lead, musk scraped from civet glands, oils aged in vinegar, and mold. Alchemy in its most dangerous form. Each breath of beauty a small dose of death. And yet, she continued. To stop would be to smell herself. The faint, human rot beneath the roses. That she could not bear. Mira tried everything. Opening windows, burning sage, praying over the bottles. Nothing helped. The scent clung to everything. The curtains, her hands, the pages of her prayers. Even the cat refused to enter Isolde's chamber. Once, Mira threw open the windows and shouted into the night, "God forgive us. We're drowning in flowers." The snow absorbed her cry without echo. Isolde's health declined, though no one said it aloud. She grew lighter, her voice softer, almost like vapor. When she moved, the air shimmered at times. People swore she wasn't walking but floating, leaving trails of scent like the wake of a dream. It was beautiful, it was horrifying. One afternoon, the artist returned again, hoping to capture her final likeness. The moment he entered, he coughed violently. "What is this smell?" he gasped. "Heaven or hell?" Isolde smiled faintly. "Whichever has the better lighting." He painted quickly, desperate to finish before the fumes consumed him. When he left, he told Mira, "She doesn't smell like a woman anymore. She smells like memory." As months passed, Isolde no longer ate. The scents filled her like sustenance. Her perfumes had become her food, her air, her faith. Sometimes, she'd whisper to her bottles like friends. "Saint's breath," she'd murmur, stroking the glass. "You've never failed me." "Amber tears," she'd sigh. "You smell like the past I've lost." Mira would listen from the doorway, weeping quietly. Perfume had replaced prayer. Then came the night of the storm. Lightning split the sky. Thunder rolled over the castle. Mira ran to her mistress's chamber and froze. The window was open, wind howling through. Candles guttered wildly, and Isolde stood before her vanity, bottles scattered like fallen soldiers. Her white gown rippled in the draught, her skin pale and trembling. "Mira," she whispered, "do you smell it?" Mira hesitated. "Smell what, my lady?" "Freedom," said Isolde. In one trembling hand, she held the last bottle, Saint's breath. Before Mira could stop her, she uncorked it and poured it over her skin. The room exploded with scent, sweet, sharp, suffocating. Mira choked, coughing through tears. "My lady, stop. You'll die." Isolde turned to her, eyes luminous in the stormlight. "Then let me die beautifully." The wind blew the candles out. The scent lingered for days. When servants entered the room later, they found only silence and the faintest trace of violets and smoke. Her body lay still, pale, serene, her hair fanned around her like a halo. And though her lips were blue, she smelled of spring. Mira buried her mistress on the hill behind the chapel, beneath a single rosebush that had never before bloomed. But after that winter, it did. Flowers so fragrant the villagers whispered that Lady Isolde had returned in scent, if not in soul. They called it the perfume of pain. Years later, travelers would still pause along that hill, draw in the air, and say, "Do you smell that? Something sweet, something sad." And the wind, passing through the rosebush, would answer softly, a sigh that smelled like memory and regret and love.
Bathing paradox. Water, in the Middle Ages, was never innocent. It could cleanse, yes, but it could also carry plague, temptation, and whispers of sin. The church said that too much bathing invited vanity. Doctors warned it opened the pores to demons. So people learned to live with their own scent, the musk of humanity layered beneath perfumes, smoke, and prayer. Cleanliness was dangerous, and filth was divine restraint. Lady Isolde's story should have ended with the perfume of pain. Yet legends have a way of clinging to the living. Mira, her faithful maid, still lingered in the castle long after Isolde's death, haunted by the smell of roses that never faded. Some nights, she swore she heard her mistress humming through the pipes, the faintest trace of melody when the rainwater rushed through the courtyard drains. It was then that Mira vowed to cleanse herself, not of guilt, but of the past. She would bathe. The decision itself was an act of rebellion. To bathe more than once a month was considered excessive. To bathe alone, in silence, with intent, heretical. Water, after all, was not trusted. It touched everyone rich and poor, holy and damned. It refused to choose sides. And so the church claimed it for penance rather than pleasure. Bathing became prayer through pain, freezing water, rough linen, whispered confessions. Mira prepared her bath at midnight when no one would see. She carried buckets of rainwater to the copper tub, the metal cold enough to burn her fingers. She added herbs she'd stolen from the apothecary, thyme for courage, rosemary for remembrance. The scent rose in pale clouds like the ghost of Isolde's perfumes, but gentler, more honest. She hesitated, watching her reflection tremble on the surface. Her face looked older, her eyes heavier. "Forgive me," she whispered to no one, and stepped in. The water bit her skin. Her body flinched. Every nerve screamed that this was wrong, that purity came not from washing, but from enduring. And yet, as she sank deeper, the pain softened. The dirt of the day, of years perhaps, loosened its hold. The smell of smoke and candle wicks began to fade. For the first time, she felt clean not as a sin, but as a surrender. In that quiet moment, she imagined Isolde beside her. Her mistress would never have allowed herself this simple grace. She had drowned in perfumes, never in water. She could almost hear her say, "Water ruins beauty, dear. It makes the truth too visible." But Mira didn't care. The truth was all she had left. By dawn, the castle stirred, monks chanting, servants bustling, the old world waking. When they found Mira's empty bed, Whispers spread quickly. "She's gone to the river," said one. "She's mad," said another. "No," said the oldest maid, crossing herself. "She's cleansing her sins." And in a sense, she was. For Mira had not returned to her duties. She returned instead to the same bath every night, until her hands wrinkled like parchment, her skin pale as prayer. Soon, others began to follow her example. Quietly at first, a few women, then a handful of men. They gathered by candlelight, filling wooden basins in secret, bathing in silence. They called it the ritual of renewal. No priest approved it, no scripture named it. But word spread as whispers do, and within months, an entire circle of silent bathers emerged, people who sought redemption not by dirt, but by water. The church was not pleased. Reports reached the bishop that a sect of water worshippers had formed, led by a servant woman possessed by cleanliness. Water, he declared from the pulpit, is the devil's mirror. It reflects pride. Bathing was soon declared an act of spiritual vanity. To soak one's body was to soak one's soul in temptation. Punishments were decreed: fines for bathers, excommunication for repeat offenders. But water, once awakened, is difficult to silence. Mira's followers grew bolder. They met in abandoned bathhouses, their candles floating in bowls like small, stubborn suns. Some washed in snowmelt, others in dew gathered from graveyards, believing it carried the purity of those who could no longer sin. They sang softly, hymns no one else knew. "Wash me not of faith, but of fear. Let the water remember what we forget." It was beautiful. It was blasphemy. When the soldiers came, Mira did not run. They found her sitting in the copper tub, the water calm and still. Her hair floated like a crown, her eyes open and steady. "You are accused," the captain said, "of unholy cleansing." Mira smiled faintly. "Then may God dirty me once more." He frowned. "You mock the church." "No," she whispered, "I mourn it." They dragged her from the bath, her wet footprints trailing like ink across the stone floor. But before they could bind her, she spoke again. "Tell your priests the truth. Water is not sin. It only reveals what you tried to hide." Her voice was soft, but it carried. Even the captain hesitated. When they locked her in the dungeon, the scent of rosemary lingered behind her, as if the air itself refused to let her vanish. Weeks passed. The castle grew restless. Bathing was outlawed entirely. Even washing hands before Mass was considered suspicious. People began to smell again, of sweat, of fear, of faith gone stale. The irony was thick as incense. They prayed harder but felt dirtier. They burned more candles, but the smoke clung to everything. Only Mira, alone in her cell, slept peacefully. Her cell had no window, but when it rained, she could feel drops slide through cracks in the ceiling. Each drop hit her face like a blessing. She'd tilt her head back and whisper, "Thank you." The guards thought she was mad, but they didn't understand. For Mira, every raindrop was holy, every trickle a hymn. Eventually, her cell door was left open. No one came for her. No one noticed when she was gone. But down by the river, villagers claimed to see a woman standing in the current, her dress billowing like mist. They said the water around her glowed faintly, and that every fish swam closer instead of away. She spoke to no one. She simply stood there, as if becoming part of the river itself. Years later, pilgrims visited that same river to bathe in her memory. They said the water there healed fevers, softened scars, and smelt faintly of time. No one mentioned her name aloud, but everyone knew. Some said she had turned into a spirit of water. Others said she had drowned. But all agreed to bathe there was to feel clean in the soul, not just the skin. And so the paradox endured. A world that feared water worshipped it in secret. A church that condemned bathing began to bless wells again. The line between purity and pride blurred, as all lines do when drawn by human hands. In the end, it wasn't water that was dangerous. It was the reflection it offered, a reminder that all filth, spiritual or otherwise, was temporary, and that true sin was forgetting how to wash.
Eyes of enchantment. They said a woman's eyes could summon angels or demons. In the candlelit courts of the 14th century, beauty no longer whispered, it bewitched. A glance could ruin reputations, a gaze could bend kings, and a single pair of dark, shimmering pupils could alter the course of alliances. But behind those captivating stares lay a secret as black as ink. A potion of death dripped into the eyes drop by drop. It was called belladonna. Belladonna, the beautiful woman. A flower soft as silk, deadly as confession. Its berries looked innocent enough, like onyx pearls scattered across the forest floor. Women, desperate to meet the rising standard of enchantment, learned from the Italians a new art of seduction, to make their pupils wide and dark, as if always in the throes of wonder or desire. They would squeeze the juice of the deadly plant into their eyes. It burned, it blurred the world, but it made them beautiful. In a court where power was as fragile as lace, such small poisons became fashionable. A lady with wide eyes was seen as tender-hearted, mysterious, gentle. All the things she was expected to be. The irony? Those same eyes saw almost nothing. For hours after each dose, the world swam in distortion. Torches became halos. Men's faces melted into fog. And yet, they smiled through it. They learned to walk slowly, to feign calm, to pretend that their blindness was grace. Lady Elaine of Normandy was the first to master the art. She was neither noble by birth nor particularly lovely by nature, but her eyes, those eyes, could drown a man's will. Her secret was simple and fatal. Every morning, her maid crushed belladonna petals in a silver bowl, mixing them with dew collected at dawn. Elaine would tilt her head back, and the maid would whisper prayers as she dropped the poison into each eye. The ritual was holy in its own way, a devotion to illusion. Within weeks, suitors spoke of her as if she were enchantment made flesh. Her eyes, one poet wrote, are deep as midnight and twice as dangerous. No one noticed that she often stumbled while walking, or that she could no longer read her letters. Her vision faded, but her legend grew. In a world where men wrote poems and women became their subjects, blindness was a small price to pay for immortality. There were others, of course. Across Europe, the fashion spread like a silent plague. In Venice, ladies dripped belladonna before masquerade balls, their darkened pupils glittering behind jeweled masks. In Paris, nuns secretly warned girls that the devil hides in the eyes of beauty. In London, apothecaries made fortunes selling tiny vials of nightshade essence wrapped in silk. Everyone wanted to be seen. No one wanted to truly see. One winter evening, Lady Elaine hosted a feast in her great hall. Torches lined the walls, their light shivering against gold goblets and velvet gowns. She sat at the head of the table, vision hazy, her eyes enormous and gleaming, like a cat caught between desire and danger. When the Duke of Béarn leaned close to toast her, she barely recognized his face. "Your eyes, my lady," he whispered, "hold storms." She smiled faintly. "Then let us pray the roof holds, my lord." The hall erupted in laughter, but Elaine's sight blurred completely. She locked herself in her chamber, trembling. She couldn't see the candlelight anymore, only the memory of its glow. "Too much," her maid begged. "You've used too much." She said nothing. She stood before the mirror, staring at the two dark wells where her pupils had been, now enormous, unnatural, almost consuming. "Do you not see?" she murmured. "I've become what they wanted." And somewhere between pride and horror, she began to laugh. Days turned to weeks. Her eyes stopped responding to light. The poison had done its final work. Doctors came, priests prayed, alchemists whispered theories, but no cure existed for vanity that grew from the roots of a deadly flower. Elaine lived on, but never again saw the world she had tried to enchant. She sat in her gardens, feeling sunlight instead of seeing it, her face still perfect, her eyes eternally wide. Visitors came to marvel at her beauty. None knew they were gazing into the abyss. But beauty, even blind, commands a strange power. Rumors said she could still read hearts even without sight, that her blindness made her prophetic, that men still came to her for counsel, drawn by the darkness that seemed to know them. Perhaps it was imagination, perhaps it was guilt. Either way, she became a legend, not of beauty, but of the price one pays for it. Elsewhere, apothecaries refined the formula. They mixed belladonna with wine or milk, softening the sting, prolonging the illusion. No longer a raw poison, it became a commodity, the elixir of dusk. Even queens were rumored to use it, and when questioned, they denied nothing. For to be pale, perfumed, and enchantingly blind was not vanity, it was survival. One monk wrote in secret, "The devil need not tempt them, they tempt themselves, drop by drop." He was later found dead near his writing desk, a broken vial of belladonna beside him. Some said it was suicide, others claimed he tried to understand the sin he condemned. In the candlelight, even holy men weren't immune to curiosity. Generations later, portraits of noble women with impossibly dark eyes hung in galleries across Europe. Painters loved the look, deep, soft, eternal. They called it the gaze of divine longing. But if you looked close enough, the eyes in those portraits seemed too open, the pupils swallowing the irises whole, as if they were still searching for the light that poison had stolen. And the fashion, like all beauty, faded eventually. By the 17th century, doctors exposed belladonna's dangers. They warned of blindness, madness, even death. But the world didn't stop chasing enchantment. It simply changed its methods. Coal replaced poison, powder replaced peril, and mirrors replaced the forest where deadly berries once bloomed. Still, in the oldest manners, servants swore the portraits of those women moved at night, that if you stared too long into their painted eyes, you'd feel something watching you back. Some said the belladonna never truly left. It merely lived on through the gaze of every admirer, a curse disguised as a compliment. Even now, the phrase "eyes of enchantment" lingers in poetry, in song, in our language of love. We still speak of losing ourselves in someone's eyes. We still worship the gaze as if it were a spell. The poison changed, but the hunger didn't. We still long to be seen, even if it blinds us. Centuries fade, fashions die, but the lesson remains suspended, like the glimmer of a candle seen through tears. Beauty demands a sacrifice, and sometimes the price is not death, but the quiet tragedy of seeing nothing, yet pretending to see everything. Lady Elaine's name eventually was erased from court records, her grave unmarked. But in the ruins of her manor, they say the mirrors are still there, dusty, cracked, yet faintly glimmering. And on nights when the mood is low, travelers claim they see a woman's reflection looking back, blind, beautiful, and smiling as though she's seen it all before.
The Rouge Revolution. The deathly pallor of medieval beauty was beginning to tire even the most patient courtiers. For centuries, pale skin had whispered of nobility, of untouched innocence, of bloodless perfection. But as the candles of the 15th century flickered higher, something changed. The world had seen too much death, too many plagues, too many ghosts. The living wanted color again. Thus began the Rouge Revolution. It did not start with war, nor with queens, but with mirrors. Women looked into them and saw not beauty, but absence. Faces like parchment, drained of warmth. They began to crave the illusion of life. So they painted it. A touch of red on the lips, a whisper of pink on the cheeks. A lie so beautiful it became truth. But like all medieval lies, it came with a price. The ingredients of beauty were stolen from the earth and the grave alike. Rouge was not made from roses, but from mercury, lead oxide, and crushed carmine beetles shipped from the far edges of trade routes. Apothecaries called it angel's dust. Poets called it the kiss of dawn. Physicians, however, called it madness in a jar. And they were right. In the manor of Montreuil, the noble women gathered each morning like soldiers before battle. They sat before silver mirrors, powdered white as bone, and dabbed their faces with tiny brushes dipped in crimson paste. The rouge came in small porcelain pots, labeled with Latin prayers to disguise the poison within. The servants knew better than to ask questions. Beauty, one maid whispered, smells like metal and death. Lady Isabel was the first in her court to wear it boldly. She was young, clever, and dangerously curious, the kind of woman who found temptation educational. When she entered the hall, her cheeks glowed like sunset against the winter air. Men stared, women whispered. "Too red," someone murmured. "Too alive," said another, as if that were an accusation. Isabel smiled. Then perhaps we'd look living again. Within months, her shade of rouge was copied across kingdoms. Venetian traders sold it as the blood of Venus. Parisian courtiers claimed it was mixed with wine blessed by monks. No one wanted to know that the red came from cinnabar, a mineral laced with mercury so toxic that miners coughed blood. The world only saw beauty, and beauty demanded sacrifice. Rouge was more than makeup. It was rebellion. To wear color was to defy death itself, to say, "I will not fade into the background of your prayers and plagues." Every dab of red was a declaration against disease, against silence, against the tyranny of pallor. But behind every declaration was decay. The women who painted their cheeks too often began to tremble. Their teeth loosened, their smiles grew metallic. And still they painted on. One evening, at a grand masquerade, Lady Isabel fainted mid-dance. Her partner caught her just before she fell, his hands coming away streaked with red. For a moment, he thought it was blood. It was not. It was beauty melting under heat. The room fell silent, as the rouge ran down her jawline like tears of war paint. And when she finally stood, she laughed softly. "Even Venus," she said, "melts in the fire." That single sentence spread faster than the fashion itself. Painters repeated it in their salons. Poets wrote it into sonnets. Merchants stamped it on little jars of rouge sold in every market. Even Venus melts in the fire. It became a slogan for the age. No one remembered the woman who first said it, but her rouge, her dangerous, glittering rouge, lived on. The church, of course, despised it. Priests preached that rouge was the mark of Jezebel, a sign of moral decay. They warned that red cheeks lured angels from their duty, but the women kept painting, even the nuns. In convents, sisters tinted their lips with beet juice for health, not vanity. In secret, they wrote prayers on scraps of parchment. Lord, forgive me for wanting to look alive. Rouge began to symbolize power, not softness. Queens wore it to intimidate, courtesans to survive. A single shade of red could separate sinner from saint, depending on who judged you. The irony was delicious. The same men who condemned rouge in church praised it at court. They feared color in women because it reminded them of blood, and blood meant power. The alchemists grew rich. They experimented endlessly, trying to make rouge safer, brighter, more permanent. Some mixed crushed rubies into the paste. Others used wine, honey, and whale oil. One even swore that a touch of powdered mummy, yes, real mummy, gave a divine hue. And people believed him, because in a world obsessed with eternal beauty, even the dead were put to work. By the late 1500s, rouge had become ritual. Women applied it the way men sharpened swords, with focus, reverence, and fear. A mirror was both altar and enemy. Each morning, the reflection asked the same question: how much of yourself will you lose today to be loved? And the answer was always the same: as much as it takes. Lady Isabel, years later, sat alone in her chamber. Her rouge pots were still lined on the table, though her hands now trembled too much to use them. Her skin had turned pale again, almost translucent. The mercury had stolen her glow, her voice, her memory. But her eyes, oh, her eyes still burned. She stared into the mirror and whispered to her fading reflection, "I brought color to the world, and it took mine away." Outside, her daughters painted their cheeks as she once did. The fashion had outlived the founder. Servants spoke of her as a myth, a muse, a warning. Her portrait hung in the great hall, red-cheeked, smiling, immortal. No one noticed that the artist had painted her eyes slightly closed, as if she could no longer bear to see what beauty had cost her. Historians later called it the Rouge Revolution, but it was not a revolution of war or politics. It was a revolution of defiance. Color, after centuries of repression, had returned to faces, and with it came something dangerous: self-awareness. For the first time, women looked in mirrors and saw not weakness, but will. Rouge was the banner of that awakening: bright, bloody, unapologetic. Of course, the poisons never truly left. Even centuries later, beauty products carried their ghosts: mercury in creams, lead in powder, arsenic in soap. We still chased perfection through pain, still measured worth in reflections. The only thing that changed was the packaging. And if you listen closely in an old manor at dusk, where the mirrors are cracked and the air smells faintly metallic, you might hear the echo of a woman's laughter, soft, amused, defiant, saying, "Even Venus melts in the fire."
Color conspiracy. The mirror never lies, but in medieval Europe, it didn't need to. Society did the lying for it. They said golden hair was a blessing from heaven, that sunlight itself had kissed those locks, that blondes were pure, angelic, untouchable. It was a convenient myth, especially for those who already happened to be born with that color. For everyone else, there was chemistry. Dark, dangerous chemistry. It began quietly in the narrow alleys of Venice.
where mirrors were made and reputations were remade. The women there, half hidden behind their veils, had a secret. They were brewing the sun. With vinegar, ashes, and a little human urine, they created a potion that promised radiance. They called it aqua bionda, the blonde water. It burned the scalp, smelled of rot, and yet they poured it over their heads as though it were holy. Under the summer light, they would sit for hours on the marble balconies, their hairs spread across silver caps with holes in them, like saints awaiting divine transformation. The mixture stung, the heat scorched, the smell clung to their skin, but beauty demanded suffering. It always had. Men passed below, pretending not to stare. They called the women angels of gold. They didn't know that beneath those halos, the scalp bled. The first written record of this ritual came from a monk named Brother Carlo. He described it not as vanity, but as alchemy of sin. He wrote, "They sit under God's own light, praying not for forgiveness, but for blondness." He condemned them publicly, but secretly, his monastery began selling the formula to noblewomen for a donation. Hypocrisy, after all, was the truest color of the Middle Ages. In France, the obsession deepened. King Charles's mistress, Isabeau of Bavaria, was rumored to have hair the color of molten gold. When her shade faded with age, her attendants brought recipes from Italy. Mixtures of sulfur, horse urine, and crushed chamomile. She applied it every week. The scent followed her like a shadow. The court said she smelled of power. No one dared to tell the truth. She smelled of death, trying to disguise itself as youth. The conspiracy wasn't only chemical, it was social. It was political. To be blonde was to be favored by men, by painters, by poets. Dark-haired women learned to vanish quietly into corners, their beauty dismissed as mysterious, which was another word for ignored. Even saints were painted with light hair, as if salvation itself came with highlights. It wasn't just about beauty. It was about hierarchy disguised as color. In Florence, artists joined the conspiracy. They painted the Virgin Mary with hair lighter than Scripture described. Gold leaf glowed around her head, a divine illusion for a divine lie. Apprentices whispered that real holiness had gone out of fashion, that now it was enough to look blessed. One painter, tired of falsity, tried to depict a dark-haired Madonna. The patron rejected it instantly. He said, "She looks too human," and that was the problem. Meanwhile, the merchants thrived. They sold bottles of sun extract and angel's vinegar. They invented words like radiance tonic, purity rinse, heaven's dew. They knew it was nothing more than acid and ammonia, but they also knew that no woman wanted the truth. She wanted transformation. One Venetian merchant even boasted that his product had been blessed by a bishop. No one asked which one. Faith, like beauty, could be bottled. There was one woman who understood the lie better than anyone. Contessa Fiora di Savona. Born with hair as black as night, she was praised for her intellect, but pitied for her color. No man marries the moon, they told her, only the sun. So Fiora studied. She bribed apothecaries, experimented with herbs, even imported crushed saffron from Persia. Her goal wasn't just to bleach her hair, it was to expose the illusion. Her experiments became infamous.
Some claimed she burned her hair off entirely and wore a wig spun from flax. Others said she succeeded, that she appeared one morning in court with hair so radiant the queen herself looked dull beside her. But Fiora never confirmed it. She only smiled and said, "Blondness is not a color, it's a currency." The phrase spread like wildfire. Poets began writing odes to golden-haired maidens. Philosophers debated whether beauty was divine or manufactured. And through it all, the quiet conspiracy deepened, a society bleaching their way to heaven. Blondness became not just desirable, but moral. It was seen as a reflection of purity, of nobility, of divine favor. And yet, in the gutters and back rooms, women whispered the recipes in secret, their hands reeking of vinegar and deceit. By the early 16th century, even the church had given up fighting it. Confessors no longer scolded women for bleaching their hair. They simply charged for absolution. Penance became another kind of tax on vanity, and women paid it gladly. After all, guilt could be washed away in a single prayer. But dark roots took weeks to hide. One summer evening, as the sun bled across the Venetian horizon, Contessa Fiora stood on her balcony with a mirror. Her hair glowed gold in the dying light, but beneath the shimmer, her scalp burned and blistered. She knew it wasn't beauty, it was pain in disguise. Yet, she smiled. Because in that moment, she understood the secret that every woman before her had learned. You don't need to believe the illusion to wield it. The hair color conspiracy was never really about hair. It was about survival. In a world ruled by men, beauty was the only power allowed to women. And if that power required deception, then deception became divine. Blondness was not nature's gift. It was women's revenge, bleached strand by strand under the gaze of a sun that had never loved them back. Pain became the price of acceptance. Vanity became a weapon. And the mirror became both confessional and battlefield. They sat beneath it, whispering prayers to the light, even as it scorched them. Because to be seen, to be chosen, to be remembered was worth burning for. Corset of Control. The corset was not born from vanity. It was born from fear. Fear of chaos, fear of curves, fear that a woman, left unshaped, might be free. In the cold corridors of medieval Europe, control was beauty, and the corset became the silent weapon of that control, stitched tight, breath by breath. It began humbly in the 14th century. A few laces here, a few strips of whalebone there. A tool to straighten posture, they said. But posture was only the beginning. Soon, the corset became something far greater, a map of obedience. Each tug of the lace whispered a rule. Each tightened breath reminded her who she was allowed to be. Maidens wore them to appear delicate. Queens wore them to appear divine. And the tailors, the quiet architects of suffering, smiled politely as women fainted in their workshops. "It fits perfectly, my lady," they would say, as ribs cracked softly beneath silk. In noble courts, the ideal figure was not a human one. It was geometry. The waist must be smaller than the hand that encircled it. The chest must rise like a promise. The hips must suggest fertility without the vulgarity of flesh. The corset achieved all of this. It sculpted illusion. It made women into statues, breathing, suffering art. They called it discipline of the body, but what it really was punishment for being alive. Because life expanded. It moved, swelled, laughed, ate, carried children. the corset denied all of it. It whispered, "Be smaller, be softer, be silent," and women obeyed, at first. In the grand halls of France, courtiers competed for the narrowest waist. Some claimed you could tell a lady's rank by how little she could breathe. There were contests, quiet, cruel little games among noble women. Who could lace the tightest, who could faint most gracefully, and who could recover fastest without smudging her rouge. A fainting spell wasn't embarrassment, it was theater, an art form. To collapse with elegance was proof that you were truly refined. Doctors, of course, began to worry. They found ribs twisted like vines, lungs half collapsed, stomachs displaced. But who listened to doctors? Fashion was faith. And in this faith, pain was holy. Tailors became priests of this religion. They measured, wrapped, and laced with ritual precision. A woman would stand for hours as fabric and bone enclosed her like armor. And yet, there was a strange duality, because while the corset was a cage, it also became protection. It hid the body from scrutiny. It gave women posture, poise, even confidence. In a world that demanded perfection, the corset delivered it, at any cost. A story from the court of Henry VIII tells of Anne Boleyn fainting at a banquet. The king rushed to her aid, believing she had been poisoned, but her maid whispered later, "It was not poison, Your Majesty. It was her corset." Anne laughed it off the next day. "Better to die beautiful," she said, "than live unshaped." History does not record whether she meant it as a joke. By the 16th century, corsets had grown rigid, reinforced with whalebone and iron. The waistline shrank. The ideal figure became impossible. And yet women kept wearing them, not because they loved the pain, but because it was the only language society understood. The corset said, "I belong." It said, "I am worthy." It said, "I fit." To take it off was rebellion. To breathe freely was scandal. In portraits, queens were depicted with impossibly narrow waists. Painters enhanced the illusion, narrowing the figure with brush strokes. Viewers marveled, unaware that beauty had been forged by suffering and perfected by paint. These portraits became propaganda. They told every young woman, "This is power. This is grace. This is what you must become." No one dared to say what every servant already knew, that grace came at the price of oxygen. There were moments of quiet resistance, a few women, brave or desperate, loosing their stays when no one was watching. Some tore their corsets apart in secret before childbirth, gasping with relief. But society was relentless. For every loosened lace, another rule appeared. If the corset didn't tighten the waist, it tightened behavior. A strange paradox began to emerge. The corset that enslaved also empowered. It gave women presence in public life. It demanded posture, made them stand tall, look strong, command attention. And yet, it took that very strength from within. Women could not shout, could barely breathe, but they could appear powerful, and sometimes that was enough. Appearances ruled the world. Among the lower classes, corsets became symbols of aspiration. Peasant girls saved for years to afford one, not for comfort, but for respect. A corset said, "I am not a servant anymore." It was a ticket into a higher world. A cruel irony, since the higher you climbed, the tighter you were bound. In London, a widow named Marjorie Stone made her fortune selling health corsets. She claimed they supported the spine and improved digestion. In truth, they did neither. But Marjorie understood what her customers really wanted, not comfort, but respect. She used silk, not iron. Her corsets sold faster than she could sew. When she died, her gravestone read, "She shaped the women of England." It wasn't wrong. Men, too, were not entirely free from the lace. Courtiers wore stays to flatten their stomachs and broaden their chests. A king who looked too natural looked too mortal. So the corset became universal, a tool of illusion.
Society itself was laced tight, stitched into a shape it could not sustain. Yet beneath the elegance, something began to shift. Pain has a way of whispering truth, and in drawing rooms and servants' corners alike, women began to ask a dangerous question. Why must beauty hurt? The question spread quietly, like the first loosened lace of a corset. And those centuries would pass before rebellion truly came, before women tore off their stays and demanded air. The first breath of freedom was already exhaled here, in the dim candlelight of a chamber where one woman dared to untie herself. For a moment, she stood trembling, corset undone, ribs expanding, lungs flooding with air. She wasn't sure whether she felt beautiful or alive. Perhaps for the first time she didn't need to choose, because maybe that was the secret hidden in every stitch, the quiet truth sewn beneath the boning, that control and beauty were never the same thing. The corset had promised perfection, but perfection, it turned out, was just another word for obedience. And the first breath after years of silence was the most beautiful sound of all.
Men had beauty battles too. History remembers the knights as warriors, not as men with mirrors. But the truth, like all medieval truths, was powdered, perfumed, and perfectly trimmed. Before they rode into battle, they did not only polish their swords, they polished themselves. Yes, even the bravest men of the Middle Ages had beauty routines. They just called them rituals of honor. In candlelit chambers across Europe, nobles stood before bronze mirrors, adjusting curls, oils, and lace. They wanted their armor to gleam, their faces to glow, their presence to command awe. Because appearance, like steel, was a weapon, and beauty, when worn correctly, could wound faster than any blade. The chronicles of King Edward IV tell of him spending hours every morning at his toilette. He was said to brush his golden hair with imported boar bristles dipped in rose water. The fragrance followed him into council meetings like a silent crown. Even the clergy whispered, "He smells too holy to be human." But Edward was not alone. From Paris to Florence, the nobleman's vanity chest rivaled that of any lady's. Oils of myrrh and lavender, powders to whiten the skin, pomades for the beard. A knight's reflection was his armor against ridicule, because to appear rough was not masculine, it was barbaric. And in a world obsessed with refinement, no man wished to look common. Their faces told stories. A pale complexion meant you lived indoors, among the privileged. Tanned skin meant you worked the fields, or worse, the sea. So men powdered their faces too. They used chalk, flour, even crushed bone mixed with vinegar. Some wore gloves day and night to keep their hands ghostly white. They would rather suffocate their skin than let the sun betray them. Hair was another battlefield. A knight's locks, long and perfumed, were symbols of nobility. Before tournaments, servants combed and curled them, coating each strand with scented oils. They called it honoring the hair of God's servant. It was vanity disguised as virtue, and everyone knew it. In France, the Duke of Burgundy once declared, "Uncombed hair is treason against beauty." No one dared disagree. Beards, too, were fashion statements. A full beard meant wisdom, a trimmed one, control. But a patchy or wild beard, that was social exile. Barbers were trusted like surgeons. They trimmed, stitched, and bled their clients, sometimes all in the same visit. For a shilling more, they would apply rose oil or musk, ensuring that even a soldier smelled like silk. Armor was no less part of the vanity. A knight's steel was polished to mirror brightness. Some even engraved verses or prayers upon their breastplates, not for God's eyes, but for the crowd's. There was pride in gleam. If you looked radiant, perhaps you would be remembered, even if you fell. And when the sun hit 1,000 suits of armor on a battlefield, it wasn't just war, it was theater. Perfume, surprisingly, was not only for women. Men wore it abundantly, mixing musk, ambergris, and cinnamon. In Italy, it was believed that scent reflected one's soul. The pure smelled divine. The corrupt stank of sin. So even monks secretly dabbled in perfume making. Some claimed the scent of sanctity was real. Others whispered it was simply rose oil in disguise. Manicures existed too, though not by name. Nobles soaked their hands in vinegar and lemon water to keep nails clean and pale. Dirty nails were the mark of a peasant. And when gloves were worn, they were perfumed with lavender and sewn with silk linings. Removing one's glove in public was not just a gesture, it was a performance of grace. The irony, of course, was that all this elegance coexisted with unimaginable filth. A man could wear pearls in his hair and still step over sewage in the street. He might sleep on velvet, yet never wash his sheets. But so long as he looked perfect by candlelight, he was safe from judgment. Cleanliness was optional. Appearance was everything. Writers of the age mocked this quiet hypocrisy. The poet Geoffrey Chaucer once described a knight whose armor shone brighter than his morals. And still the crowd adored him, because beauty, even in men, excused nearly everything. It was said that a handsome knight could break 10 hearts before breakfast and be praised for his charm. An ugly one could save a kingdom and still be forgotten. In royal courts, fashion was war without blood. Men competed with color and fabric instead of swords. Velvet doublets, embroidered sleeves, jeweled collars, each garment a declaration of rank. Some even wore codpieces so exaggerated that poets called them trophies of vanity. They swaggered not for survival, but for spectacle. It was absurd, and it was magnificent. In Spain, beauty took on a darker edge. Their pale faces were powdered almost blue to mimic holy suffering. Knights starved themselves to appear more ascetic, believing that pain purified the flesh. So even their beauty was rooted in discipline and denial, the same forces that shaped the corset on a woman's body. But perhaps the strangest ritual of all was emotional restraint. A true nobleman never laughed too loudly, never blushed, never cried. His face was a mask, trained, rehearsed, and flawless. Composure was elegance. Passion was vulgar. They spent hours perfecting the art of indifference, even when their hearts burned beneath brocade and steel. There were, of course, rebels. A few poets and knights refused to follow fashion's leash. They let their beards grow wild, their skin darken under the sun, but society punished them with ridicule. A rough man was mistaken for a fool, and fools in the Middle Ages rarely survived long. So the men endured their vanity. They wore it like armor, not to seduce, but to survive. For in a world where power and appearance were twins, to look perfect was to stay safe. Even kings feared ugliness, for ugliness was mistaken for weakness. And weakness, like an unshined sword, was fatal. It's easy now to laugh at them, these perfumed warriors and powdered princes. But they were not so different from us. They used what they had: mirrors, oils, fabrics, light. They shaped themselves into ideals that could win battles, court love, and hide fear. Under every polished breastplate was a trembling heart hoping to be seen as worthy. Because beauty was never truly feminine or masculine. It was the currency of the powerful and the burden of the powerless. And whether wrapped in silk or steel, every man who looked in the mirror saw the same thing every woman did: a face he hoped the world would forgive.
Medieval makeup gurus. Long before beauty tutorials filled glowing screens, they were written in trembling Latin by candlelight. The first makeup gurus did not wear gowns of silk. They wore robes of wool. And they lived not in castles, but in monasteries.
Their followers were not subscribers, they were sinners, queens, and curious souls willing to trade confession for complexion. It began innocently enough. In the 12th century, monks in secluded abbeys began recording recipes for ointments and unguents. They said these were for healing the sick. And perhaps they were, at first. But somewhere between medicine and miracle, the line blurred. When a salve meant to soothe burns also brightened the skin, the monks took note. When a tincture that treated rash made the cheeks glow, they wrote that down too. Soon their libraries smelt less like parchment and more like perfume. Brother Thomas of York was one such man. He was known across the shires for his holy balms. Pilgrims came from miles away, claiming his potions cured illness and sadness alike. But his journals tell a different story. In the margins, beside prayers and hymns, he scribbled something that would sound familiar to any modern beautician. To make the skin shine, crush pearls and mix with honey. Apply gently upon the face before dawn. Holy words wrapped around sinful secrets. Another monk, Brother Matteo of Florence, created an elixir of radiance. He claimed it was blessed by Saint Cecilia herself. It was actually made from egg whites, rose water, and powdered silver. Women came in disguise to his abbey. They pretended to seek forgiveness, but left with tiny bottles hidden beneath their cloaks. Matteo told them it was for spiritual purity. But purity, it seemed, looked suspiciously like flawless skin. Soon rumors spread of entire monasteries doubling as beauty laboratories. In France, the Abbey of Saint Michel became famous not for its sermons, but for its soaps. In Germany, Dominican friars experimented with tinted wax to disguise scars, to restore God's symmetry, they said. In Italy, the Franciscans brewed face tonics with herbs and wine, promising that beauty is health made visible. It was the medieval equivalent of a skincare slogan. Of course, the church did not approve. Beauty, they warned, was vanity, and vanity a sin. But the monks argued back. Does not the Lord make flowers bright? Then why should his creation not shine also? A theological loophole and an effective one. As long as they called it medicine, they could sell miracles. The recipes themselves were both poetic and perilous. To remove freckles, one manual advised, grind frog fat and mix with vinegar. To brighten the eyes, another suggested, apply a drop of bat's blood mixed with milk. Alchemy met absurdity. And yet people believed, because in an age where even illness was divine punishment, beauty felt like forgiveness. The monks weren't alone. In the Arab world, scholars like Avicenna were already writing detailed guides on oils, perfumes, and pigments. Texts that would later reach Europe through trade and translation. These Arabic manuscripts became sacred to Western alchemists, who copied them line by line, changing only one thing. They replaced self-care with spiritual cleansing. In truth, both meant the same thing, but the church preferred one version over the other. Meanwhile, in royal courts, noble women whispered about these holy beauticians. Queens sent secret messengers to monasteries requesting remedies for blemishes, powders for paleness, elixirs for virtue. Virtue, of course, was just another name for vanity with permission. One chronicler wrote, "The queen confesses each week, yet her confessor grows richer and she grows fairer." There was even competition among the monasteries. The Benedictines of Canterbury claimed their rose balm was purer than the French. The Cistercians retaliated with honey masks favored by angels. Recipes were guarded like relics. Some monks were accused of sorcery, others of seduction, but the demand only grew. No matter how often priests preached against vanity, the people listened to the monks with better skin. A strange partnership developed between holiness and hedonism, between prayer and powder.
An abbey might bless bread in the morning and bottle lip balm by evening. And the same hands that copied scripture also crushed herbs and blended.
Medieval makeup gurus. Long before beauty tutorials filled glowing screens, they were written in trembling Latin by candlelight. The first makeup gurus did not wear gowns of silk, they wore robes of wool. And they lived not in castles, but in monasteries. Their followers were not subscribers, they were sinners, queens, and curious souls willing to trade confession for complexion. It began innocently enough. In the 12th century, monks in secluded abbeys began recording recipes for ointments and unguents. They said these were for healing the sick, and perhaps they were, at first. But somewhere between medicine and miracle, the line blurred. When a salve meant to soothe burns also brightened the skin, the monks took note. When a tincture that treated rash made the cheeks glow, they wrote that down too. Soon their libraries smelled less like parchment and more like perfume. Brother Thomas of York was one such man. He was known across the shires for his holy balms. Pilgrims came from miles away, claiming his potions cured illness and sadness alike. But his journals tell a different story. In the margins, beside prayers and hymns, he scribbled something that would sound familiar to any modern beautician. Quote, "To make the skin shine, crush pearls and mix with honey. Apply gently upon the face before dawn." Holy words wrapped around sinful secrets. Another monk, Brother Matteo of Florence, created an elixir of radiance. He claimed it was blessed by Saint Cecilia herself. It was actually made from egg whites, rose water, and powdered silver. Women came in disguise to his abbey. They pretended to seek forgiveness, but left with tiny bottles hidden beneath their cloaks. Matteo told them it was for spiritual purity, but purity, it seemed, looked suspiciously like flawless skin. Soon rumors spread of entire monasteries doubling as beauty laboratories. In France, the Abbey of Saint Michel became famous not for its sermons, but for its soaps. In Germany, Dominican friars experimented with tinted wax to disguise scars, to restore God's symmetry, they said. In Italy, the Franciscans brewed face tonics with herbs and wine, promising that beauty is health made visible. It was the medieval equivalent of a skincare slogan. Of course, the church did not approve. Beauty, they warned, was vanity, and vanity a sin. But the monks argued back. Quote, "Does not the Lord make flowers bright? Then why should his creation not shine also?" End quote. A theological loophole, and an effective one. As long as they called it medicine, they could sell miracles. The recipes themselves were both poetic and perilous. Quote, "To remove freckles, grind frog fat and mix with vinegar." End quote. "To brighten the eyes," end quote, "apply a drop of bat's blood mixed with milk." End quote. Alchemy met absurdity. And yet people believed, because in an age where even illness was divine punishment, beauty felt like forgiveness. The monks weren't alone. In the Arab world, scholars like Avicenna were already writing detailed guides on oils, perfumes, and pigments, texts that would later reach Europe through trade and translation. These Arabic manuscripts became sacred to Western alchemists, who copied them line by line, changing only one thing. They replaced self-care with spiritual cleansing. In truth, both meant the same thing, but the church preferred one version over the other. Meanwhile, in royal courts, noble women whispered about these holy beauticians. Queens sent secret messengers to monasteries requesting remedies for blemishes, powders for paleness, elixirs for virtue. Virtue, of course, was just another name for vanity with permission. One chronicler wrote, quote, "The queen confesses each week, yet her confessor grows richer, and she grows fairer." End quote. There was even competition among the monasteries. The Benedictines of Canterbury claimed their rose balm was purer than the French. The Cistercians retaliated with honey masks favored by angels.
Recipes were guarded like relics. Some monks were accused of sorcery, others of seduction, but the demand only grew. No matter how often priests preached against vanity, the people listened to the monks with better skin. A strange partnership developed between holiness and hedonism, between prayer and powder. An abbey might bless bread in the morning and bottle lip balm by evening. And the same hands that copied scripture also crushed herbs and blended pigments, writing in secret margins, quote, to soften the face and delight the eyes, end quote. Not all of them were hypocrites. Some believed sincerely that beauty was a reflection of divine harmony, that tending to the body was a form.
The curse of the mirror. In the dim candlelight of a medieval chamber, a woman stared at her reflection in polished glass and shivered. Not from cold, but from the quiet terror that the face staring back was not entirely her own. To us, a mirror is a simple thing, a flat truth, but to them, it was a dangerous lie. The Middle Ages were not kind to reflections. Most people never saw their own faces clearly. There were no bathroom mirrors, no silver compacts, no glinting glass above the hearth. To see oneself was a privilege or a curse. Polished metal plates, bits of still water, or darkened glass were the only options. They reflected more ghost than flesh, and that suited the medieval imagination perfectly. Because in a world haunted by demons and saints alike, a mirror could never be trusted. It began with a superstition, as most curses do. They said that when you looked into a mirror, your soul leaned forward to greet its own image. But what if something else leaned forward too? What if, in that fragile shimmer between light and glass, something unholy blinked back? Some believed mirrors were doorways to the spirit realm, others that they captured the very soul of a person. To break one was not bad luck, it was murder. In English abbeys, priests warned nuns never to keep mirrors in their cells. They said, "The devil loves a face that stares at itself." In Germany, folk tales told of mirrors that whispered sins back at night. And in France, noble women covered theirs before sleeping, lest their reflections watch them dream. It wasn't mere paranoia, it was theology. Beauty was already dangerous. Reflection made it doubly so. When mirrors began to spread among the wealthy, they were seen as instruments of vanity, and vanity, everyone agreed, belonged to Lucifer. After all, who was the first to fall for his own reflection? The archangel who thought himself too beautiful to bow. So each time a woman admired her pale skin or a man adjusted his curls, whispers stirred through the hall. Another angel looking too long at his own light. But superstition alone was never enough for the medieval imagination. They needed stories, proof wrapped in fear. And so came tales of cursed mirrors. In Italy, a nobleman named Rinaldo was said to own a glass that showed his true soul. Each time he lied, his reflection aged a year. By 40, he still looked young in the flesh, but his reflection was a corpse. He smashed the mirror, they say, and 3 days later fell dead at its feet. In England, there was Lady Isolde, a widow who owned a mirror polished from obsidian. She claimed she could see her dead husband in it. At first she wept with joy, then with horror, because one night his reflection smiled before she did. When her servants found her body, the mirror was cracked, not shattered,
just cracked, like something inside was still alive. These stories spread through taverns, castles, and cathedrals alike. Each telling made the mirror a little darker, a little more alive. Even the church joined in. A 14th century sermon warned, "To gaze long upon thine image is to let the serpent see thine heart."
Jewelry as armor. In the flickering light of the medieval world, gold did not glitter, it glowed. And that glow was more than beauty. It was safety. It was a spell. Jewelry was not vanity. It was survival. A woman's necklace might guard her from the plague. A knight's ring could deflect misfortune. A priest's jeweled cross was both a prayer and a weapon. They wore their faith, fear, and fortune on their skin, for in an age where even mirrors were cursed, a little gold felt like a shield. The Middle Ages had no shortage of danger: disease, war, sin, superstition. And when danger hides everywhere, people cling to anything that shines. To us, jewelry is a luxury. To them, it was armor that whispered, "You are protected." A sapphire could cure fevers, an emerald could guard against demons, a ruby could calm anger, and, conveniently, attract lovers. Each gem had a purpose, each ring was a promise, and each pendant was a prayer cast in metal. But make no mistake, not everyone could afford protection. Gold belonged to God and kings. The poor had iron, tin, bone, and hope. They carved amulets from sheep teeth, wove coins into their hair, and prayed their crude charms worked just as well as gemstones. Because in a time where sin was blamed for sickness, faith itself became wearable. One chronicler described a peasant woman during a famine. She owned nothing but a broken copper brooch. Yet every morning she kissed it before leaving her hut. "St. Anne watches me through it," she said. That wasn't superstition, that was survival in disguise. Faith had to be portable. When the world offered no shelter, a trinket could serve as a fortress. In royal courts, the story glittered differently. Jewelry there was both armor and announcement. Every gem was a political statement, every brooch a map of loyalty. The deeper the color, the higher the status. The heavier the crown, the heavier the conscience. A queen's jewels told her story better than her words. They said, "I am untouchable. I am chosen. I am more than flesh." And yet, beneath all that brilliance, she was just another woman afraid of losing favor, beauty, or life. One such queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was said to own a pendant shaped like a falcon, its eyes made of garnet, its wings of sapphire. It wasn't just a fashion statement, it was armor. The falcon symbolized freedom, vigilance, and defiance, and Eleanor wore it in defiance of her husband, King Henry II. Chroniclers whispered that when the king grew angry, Eleanor touched the falcon's beak, a small, secret gesture of power. The jewelry could not stop his wrath, but it reminded her she still had her own. Men, too, wore their fears as finery. Knights carried talismans sewn into their tunics, tiny crucifixes, saint medallions, or locks of hair. They called them relics of protection. In truth, they were just another kind of armor, not forged by smiths, but by superstition.
Some knights refused to ride into battle without their lover's ring tied to their sword hilt. Others wore amethyst stones to stay sober, a charming lie to tell their priests after victory feasts. And what of the church? Surely they condemned such vanities. Not quite. While priests thundered from pulpits about the dangers of worldly glitter, they themselves dripped in gold thread and jeweled crosses. The church called it divine adornment. The people called it hypocrisy. But in truth, the clergy understood something subtle. Ornament commands obedience. When a bishop's mitre sparkled like heaven, who would dare argue his authority? Jewelry in its way became the language of control. A ring could seal a deal or a marriage. A chain could represent faith or imprisonment. A crown could bless or crush. Those who owned the most gold owned the most power, not because gold was rare, but because it reflected divine light. To question it was to question God's choice. But among the common folk, jewelry meant something far more intimate. Lovers exchanged trinkets, rings, ribbons, or braided hair, each promising eternal devotion. But love in the Middle Ages was rarely eternal. So when hearts broke, so did charms. Many buried their jewelry in fields or rivers, believing that if they let the earth swallow it, their pain would vanish too. Archaeologists still find those buried heartbreaks. Tiny love stories turned to rust. There were also darker purposes. Some women wore jewelry laced with poison, rings with hidden compartments, brooches with retractable needles. Better to die in beauty than live in shame, one noblewoman was said to murmur, tightening her jeweled choker before attending court. Jewelry protected the body, but sometimes it offered a way to escape it. And then there were the amulets. No one truly trusted medicine in the Middle Ages, so they trusted metals instead. A silver cross could cure epilepsy, a coral bead could stop bleeding, an amber necklace could ward off the plague. Some even wore tiny reliquaries around their necks, lockets containing the bones of saints, a drop of holy water, or a scrap of parchment with a prayer. When death came for everyone else, they believed the saints might whisper, "Not this one." But not all jewelry was blessed. Cursed jewels passed from hand to hand, each owner richer, then ruined. The blood ruby of Lorraine was said to drive its wearer mad with jealousy. The tear of St. Agnes supposedly brought death to any man who kissed the woman who wore it. Whether true or not, the fear gave jewelry a strange new power: mystery. And mystery sells better than faith. For some, though, jewelry wasn't magic or protection, it was rebellion. Peasant women wore copper earrings in defiance of church edicts banning vain adornment. Widows dyed beads black and wore them in mourning, despite priests forbidding such displays. Every sparkle was a whisper of resistance. Every chain was a quiet refusal to disappear. Because in a world ruled by men and fear, beauty was one of the few powers women could wield without permission. Jewelry could also disguise the body's truth. A highborn lady might hide a scar beneath a jeweled collar. A knight might wear a gold brooch to cover a stab wound from a duel never spoken of. Adornment was deception, and deception in those days was survival. Each glittering piece was a story rewritten, a truth hidden behind the gleam. And through it all, one thing remained constant: the belief that jewelry had a soul. Gold, they said, remembered every hand it touched. Silver absorbed sin. Pearls wept with their wearers. That's why nobles passed down jewels through generations, not for wealth, but for protection. The more a piece had witnessed, the stronger it became. A grandmother's ring was not just sentimental, it was sanctified by endurance. Even death could not break that bond. When a noble died, their jewelry was often buried with them, not as treasure, but as companionship. "Let her not be naked before God," one priest wrote, placing a sapphire rosary in a dead queen's hands. To enter heaven adorned was to show respect for the Creator's craft. After all, if God made the stars to shine, why shouldn't his children do the same? But the truest irony of all was this: jewelry that began as protection often became a prison. A woman's choker tightened more than her neck, a crown pressed down harder than its weight, a ring bound love as much as it promised. The armor that glittered was also the armor that suffocated. And yet, they kept wearing them, because without their jewels, they were just flesh and fear. But with them, they were saints, queens, warriors, creatures of light wrapped in metal, defying the darkness that wanted them small. To wear gold was to say, "I exist." To sparkle was to survive. Centuries later, when archaeologists dig up graves of those long gone, the bones have crumbled, the fabric rotted, but the jewelry remains. Rings, brooches, chains, pins, still gleaming, still defiant. And maybe that was the secret all along. Maybe they never wore jewelry to look beautiful. Maybe they wore it to be remembered. Because in the end, the truest armor against time is the one.
Beauty was dangerous business. The medieval world adored beauty, but it did not trust it. To be beautiful was to be blessed and cursed in the same breath. Because in a time when the church preached humility and death lingered at every door, to shine too brightly was to invite suspicion, sin, and sometimes the noose. Beauty could elevate a peasant girl to a queen's bed, and then to the executioner's block. It could win wars, end marriages, inspire pilgrimages, or spark witch trials. And beneath the rouge, the lace, and the lacework prayers lay a simple truth. Being admired was never safe. The dangers began with the simplest of things: ingredients. To whiten their skin, women smeared their faces with ceruse, a deadly blend of lead and vinegar. It went on smoothly, like moonlight pressed against the flesh. But beneath the glow, the poison worked silently, eating away at blood and bone. Their beauty didn't fade, it decayed. Yet the fashion persisted, because in a world that worshipped pallor, dying beautifully was better than living plain. Perfumes were no safer. A lady's favorite scent might contain musk from civet cats, ambergris scraped from whale debts, or oil distilled with arsenic and mercury. They dabbed it on wrists, throats, and even lips. The more exotic the odor, the higher the status, and the greater the risk. They called it refinement. Modern medicine would call it slow suicide. And then there was the makeup of madness. To darken their lashes, women burned almonds and mixed the ash with lamp oil. To redden their cheeks, they used crushed cochineal beetles or cinnabar, which was unfortunately mercury again. They painted poison in pursuit of perfection. Each mirror glance was a gamble. And yet, vanity rarely loses. They powdered their hair with lead dust, smiled through bleeding gums, and called it grace. The church saw it all and panicked. Priests thundered from pulpits. To alter God's face is to mock his creation. But the same priests secretly commissioned portraits of women whose cheeks glowed like dawn. Hypocrisy wore a halo in those days. And so the sermons grew louder. They warned that painted women tempted demons, that rouge was the devil's blush. It didn't stop anyone.
It only made beauty more thrilling, a sin worth wearing. And then came the politics of beauty. Kings and popes alike understood its power. A beautiful woman could sway diplomacy better than any army. A handsome knight could break alliances with a smile. So beauty was cultivated, trained, trimmed, tested. It became a weapon of statecraft. When Anne Boleyn walked into Henry VIII's court, men saw charm, women saw danger, and history proved them right. But even outside royal circles, beauty was a liability. A merchant's wife might be accused of witchcraft if her skin stayed too smooth through winter. A milkmaid might draw envy or stones if her hair caught too much sunlight. To look unnatural was to invite divine suspicion. So women learned to hide their beauty behind veils, to smile only when alone, and to pray that admiration wouldn't become accusation. In villages, whispers spread faster than plague. She keeps her youth too long. Her eyes shine like moonlight. Her husband never sickens. It didn't take much for the next line to follow. She must have made a pact. And thus beauty, the very thing that made a woman special, could become her death sentence. One story tells of Marjorie Holt of Suffolk. She was known for her clear skin and bright eyes, and for herbs that eased childbirth. When the Lord's wife died in labor, they blamed Marjorie's witch touch. The villagers dragged her to the river. She floated, of course, because silk floats. They called it proof. Her beauty died that day, but the legend of her blow lingered for generations. Even queens weren't safe from the poison of perfection. Catherine de' Medici's court was notorious for cosmetics, powders that burned, lip stains that scarred, perfumes that choked. Every lady shimmered like a painting and coughed like a dying bird. When one noblewoman collapsed at a banquet, the royal physician simply muttered, "Her beauty has consumed her." And everyone nodded, as though that was the natural price. Beauty, in the medieval world, was both currency and confession. If you had it, you were blessed, but you owed it to God to use it properly. If you flaunted it, you were guilty of pride. If you lost it, you were pitied. A lose-lose equation painted in powder and prayer. So women balanced their souls like mirrors on glass. Too much reflection and they'd fall into sin. Too little and they'd vanish. Men had their own beauty hazards. Knights polished their armor until it gleamed brighter than their futures. Courtly men powdered their faces, dyed their beards, perfumed their gloves. The wrong shade could earn mockery. Too much scent could brand you effeminate. And yet, too little meant you lacked grace. Even masculinity had its poisons. They just came bottled in pride instead of lead. Doctors of the time, those rare optimists, tried to warn against dangerous beauty rituals. They published manuals like De Ornatum Mulierum on the adornment of women, filled with safer recipes for powder and perfume. But even their safe versions contained lead, mercury, and arsenic, just smaller doses. Their advice read like gallows humor: use sparingly, lest you perish before the feast. Still, some resisted the madness. Mystics and nuns wrote that true beauty lived in humility. They called painted faces the masks of the fallen. One nun, Sister Beatrix of Bruges, wrote that every blush of paint hides the blush of the soul. But even she couldn't escape the irony. Her letters were said to smell faintly of rosewater. The cruelest twist of all was that beauty, once achieved, could not be owned. It belonged to the gaze of others, to men, to God, to rumor, to envy. A woman might spend her youth crafting her face like a saint's icon, only for it to be turned into a weapon against her. To be beautiful was to be exposed. To be plain was to be invisible. And in the medieval world, invisibility was safer. Artists captured this irony perfectly. In paintings of the Virgin Mary, her beauty glowed with holiness, but her eyes never met the viewers. In portraits of noble women, their faces shone like porcelain, but their necks strained under jewels and stiff lace, a quiet reminder that perfection was a prison. The more divine they looked, the less human they became. Even death couldn't free them. When plague swept through Europe, some women were found dead with powder still on their cheeks, lips tinted crimson, undone but not unpainted. Chroniclers wrote of them with pity and a hint of admiration. They died as angels might, with faces that denied decay. They called it vanity, but maybe it was defiance. And that, perhaps, is the truest heart of the story. Beauty was not just dangerous because of poison or pride. It was dangerous because it gave ordinary people a kind of power that frightened the powerful. The church could control souls. Kings could control armies. But beauty made them tremble. It was unpredictable, uncontrollable, and unforgettable. So the medieval world wrapped beauty in fear, called it sinful, fatal, cursed. But still, they chased it. Still, they painted their faces in moonlight, bathed in herbs, and whispered small prayers that they might glow one day longer. Because even when beauty killed, it made you matter, and that, in a cruel world, was worth dying for.
Standards of perfection. Perfection in the Middle Ages was not a goal. It was a cage with gilded bars, and inside it sat every woman who ever dared to be seen. To be perfect was not to be beautiful. It was to fit into a drawing, one made by men who had never bled, never birthed, never aged. The artists called it proportion. The priests called it purity. The poets called it love. The women called it exhausting. Imagine living in a world where the most admired face was not the one you were born with, but the one that could survive the rules. Your forehead had to be high enough to let in reason, your skin pale enough to prove your soul was clean, your waist narrow enough to prove restraint, your voice soft enough to prove obedience. Every feature was a sermon, every glance was an examination. The church, of course, had its hand in defining beauty. To be too bright, too adorned, too alive, that was vanity, the gateway sin. But to be too dull, too plain, too unkempt, that was sloth, another sin. Somewhere between the two sins, a woman was supposed to find perfection. No wonder she prayed so often. In paintings, saints were drawn with impossible grace. Skin untouched by the sun, hair like polished flax, eyes heavy with sorrow but never fatigue. These faces became templates. Real women were told to mimic them. To look holy was to survive. To look earthly was to risk everything. Thus, holiness and horror became sisters in the mirror. For men, perfection had its own tortures. Knights were supposed to be tall, broad-shouldered, unsmiling, a portrait of chivalric control. To grow old was failure. To limp, shameful. To lose a tooth or scar a face was to lose status. And yet, their lives were spent on battlefields, the very places that guaranteed imperfection. Even heroes couldn't live up to their statues. Artists called their beauty ideals divine geometry. Every feature could be measured by ratio and symmetry, as if God had used a compass when shaping cheeks. Mathematicians joined in, writing formulas for the perfect face. A straight nose at 45 degrees, eyes spaced one eye apart, lips forming a gentle arc like a church window.
no one noticed that almost no living human matched it. But math has never cared for mercy. And so, people tried to become the numbers. Women plucked hairlines until their foreheads looked like marble domes. Men bound their bellies in iron corsets to mimic armor. Young girls were taught to walk with books on their heads, so their posture would mirror cathedral spires. They weren't just shaping bodies, they were sculpting prayers. Even the poor were not spared. A peasant woman could never afford jewels, but she could still whiten her face with chalk or curdled milk, or rub her lips with elderberry to look alive enough for marriage. She wasn't chasing nobility, she was chasing survival. Because beauty, even among the poor, meant better treatment, lighter labor, sometimes simply food. In a cruel world, pretty was power. But perfection, like any currency, inflated fast. When everyone wanted pale skin, true pallor became the mark of luxury. So the rich stayed indoors and the poor pretended they were dying. When thinness became the sign of refinement, the rich dieted for show, while the starving became accidental fashion icons. The line between tragedy and trend grew paper thin and often powdered white. What made all this worse was that the standards kept changing. One century loved blondes, the next worshipped brunettes. One king adored round faces, the next demanded angles. Women lived at the mercy of taste. Theirs never counted. And men, they judged, pretended not to care, then funded the very artists who painted perfection into eternity. The cruelest joke, though, was that perfection had no finish line. You could spend your whole life chasing it and die before you got close. In some convents, nuns wrote about this tragedy with sympathy. In one parchment from 1382, Sister Agnes wrote, "We're told that Eve's sin was pride of beauty, yet we spend our lives punishing ourselves for her face." It was a quiet rebellion, inked in humility and hidden behind veils. Meanwhile, nobles turned perfection into entertainment. At feasts, women were ranked like paintings. There were contests for fairest skin, sweetest breath, most elegant hands. Men wagered on their wives' beauty like they bet on horses. And behind every jeweled smile, a woman wondered if she would still be loved when her powder ran out. Even the language betrayed them. The word fair once meant just and noble. By the late Middle Ages, it meant light-skinned and beautiful. Words that once spoke of virtue were hijacked by vanity. Perfection had rewritten morality. To be good was to be glowing. To be honest was to be unblemished. And the darker your skin, the farther you stood from grace. This toxic ideal wasn't just gendered, it was globalized. Crusaders returned from the East with stories of exotic beauty, and Europe's obsession deepened. Every foreign feature was exoticized or erased, depending on who held the paintbrush. In palaces, nobles painted themselves lighter. Even their portraits were bleached with lead. The more pale they looked, the closer they were to power. Perfection, it seemed, was just another name for politics. Still, some dared to defy it. Writers like Christine de Pizan mocked men's hypocrisy. They desire angels but marry women and then complain of wings. Others painted imperfection as charm, a crooked smile, a scar, a spark of mischief. But their ideas rarely survived beyond court salons. Perfection was too profitable to abandon. After all, every flaw meant another potion, another mirror, another lie to sell. By the late 15th century, the ideal woman had become a ghost. Her hair was sunlight, her skin marble, her waist a whisper, her soul pure but silent. She did not exist, and yet she ruled every mind. Even those who knew better still compared themselves to her. Even the artists who invented her apologized for their wives. And what of the men? Their perfection was power. A man's beauty was measured in conquest. his virtue in control. He could be scarred and still noble, gray-haired and still wise. But a woman with a wrinkle was fading. They called it nature, but it was never natural. Some chroniclers noticed the cost. In a diary from 1499, a Florentine merchant wrote, "I have seen women pale as ghosts, trembling from their powders, yet they still smile, for they would rather die admired than live unseen." It reads like poetry, but it's really pathology. A civilization so obsessed with surface that it forgot the body beneath the paint. By the dawn of the Renaissance, the standards only grew sharper. Perfection now meant balance, symmetry, harmony, proportion. Science joined art in policing the face. Physicians wrote that ugliness was disease, that beauty proved good health. The irony? Their patients were dying from beauty creams. But the lie was too convenient to die. It has survived centuries, perhaps even to your own mirror. Because here's the truth whispered across the ages. The medieval world didn't invent impossible beauty. It just named it holy. And we, centuries later, are still praying to its reflection.
The moral of the mirror. The story of beauty began long before the mirror, but it was the mirror that gave beauty a soul. In the dim light of medieval chambers, women and men once leaned over bowls of polished bronze or water, searching for themselves in the trembling surface. They didn't just want to see their faces, they wanted to see their worth. And that, more than anything, is what makes the mirror dangerous. For the mirror has never been glass alone. It has always been a witness, a confessor, a judge, a friend who never truly listens. It reflects what you give it, but never what you need. Back then, it told women they were too pale, too dark, too proud, too plain. Now it tells us the same things, only faster, louder, with filters and screens. The mirror has changed shape, but not purpose. The medieval world feared reflection because it feared self-awareness. To look upon your own face was to confront the proof that you were more than body, that you could think, doubt, desire. The church warned that mirrors led to vanity, but perhaps what they truly feared was that mirrors led to identity. Because the moment a woman saw herself clearly, she began to wonder why the world wanted her to disappear. Every powdered cheek, every gilded comb, every whispered prayer before a looking glass, these were not acts of pride, they were survival. To be seen as beautiful was to be tolerated, protected, even believed. To be unseen was to vanish, a fate worse than sin. So they painted, powdered, and prayed, not to please vanity, but to hold existence together. The mirror became their proof of life. A single reflection meant the world hadn't erased them yet. That, perhaps, was the truest function of beauty in the medieval age. Not decoration, but declaration. A soft rebellion in a world built to silence softness. But the rebellion came with a cost. The same mirror that affirmed life also poisoned it. It told women they were not beautiful enough, that their reflection was a promise they could never fulfill. So they crushed pearls for powder, bled themselves pale, swallowed poisons in pursuit of purity. They sought perfection in the reflection of their own decay. And the mirror, ever loyal, showed them only what they wished to see, until it was too late. Historians write of lead and mercury, but they often forget the real toxin, the idea that beauty could buy peace. The mirror made it seem possible, but peace bought through perfection was peace on credit, and the debt was always death. By the end of the medieval age,
mirrors had spread beyond palaces. Artisans in Venice learned to coat glass with silver, creating the first true reflections. People could finally see themselves as they were, and most didn't like it. For the first time, the truth was too clear. The shadows on the face, the lines, the tired eyes, proof that humanity was imperfect by design. Instead of learning to love that, they tried to erase it. And so began the modern age of illusion. The mirror became a marketplace. It sold not just reflection, but redemption. If you didn't like what you saw, you could buy something to fix it. Creams, powders, prayers, nothing truly changed except the packaging. The medieval vanity table turned into the modern bathroom shelf. The holy water became skincare. The sermons became slogans. The message stayed the same. You are almost enough. Almost. The mirror, patient and cruel, watched the centuries roll by. It watched women in corsets, men in wigs, soldiers polishing medals, actresses painting faces beneath gaslight. It watched the invention of the camera, its brighter, sharper child, and saw humanity fall deeper in love with its own fiction. The mirror had never needed to lie. Humans did that for it. But still, it held beauty's secret. The same one it held for the medieval girl who once looked into a bowl of river water and smiled at herself. The secret was never the reflection, it was the recognition. That moment when a person, however briefly, sees not what others demand, but what is truly theirs. The warmth in the eyes, the stubborn curl of the lip, the flicker of life that cannot be powdered out. That was always the moral and the mercy of the mirror. Of course, few ever learned it. Perfection was louder, perfection was profitable, and so the lie endured. It hid in art, in fashion, in cinema, in the quiet insecurities that fill every mirror-lit room. Even now we are descendants of that medieval spell, the one that says beauty must hurt, that worth must be visible, that reflection defines reality. But the mirror has one more truth to give, and it is the simplest one. When you look long enough, you begin to see through the surface. The reflection stops being a face and starts being a story. A map of survival, a record of laughter and loss, a portrait of persistence. That is beauty, not in the perfection, but in the proof that you are still here. Imagine the medieval woman again. She sits by candlelight, her hands trembling as she lifts the mirror, a small warped piece of metal. She stares. Her face is not what she hoped. There are lines of work, of hunger, of weather and worry. And yet, her eyes shine. For in that moment, she sees herself, not sin or flaw, but herself. The same self she has prayed for, bled for, endured for. She smiles, and the mirror, for the first time, smiles back. That is the ending the history books forget. Not the poisons or powders, not the sermons or shame, but the quiet reclaiming of reflection. The day a woman looked into the mirror and no longer asked, "Am I beautiful enough?" She simply said, "I am." The moral of the mirror is not about beauty at all. It is about mercy. The mercy to forgive your reflection for being human. The mercy to see that the pursuit of perfection was never about vanity. It was fear. Fear of aging, fear of rejection, fear of vanishing. And yet, to see yourself truly is to vanish from nothing. It is to exist without permission. So perhaps, after all these centuries, we can finally rewrite the rule. The medieval mirror taught us to ask, "Am I beautiful enough?"
But the real question, the one that saves us, is softer. Am I kind enough to what I see? If the answer is yes, the mirror loses its power, and the soul at last recognizes itself. Because in the end, the mirror is not history's villain. It is simply a reflection of the human condition, fragile, foolish, and forever reaching for light. And maybe that reaching, that endless shimmering attempt to see ourselves clearly, is not vanity at all. Maybe it is hope. The candle flickers out, the mirror fades into shadow, the centuries fall silent. But somewhere, in a quiet room, in a soft light, a modern face leans towards its reflection, still asking the same question: what makes me beautiful? And the mirror, tired but tender, answers the only way it knows how: the fact that you're still asking.